"What are you digging around for?" Nick shouted impatiently from the bedroom. Annie flinched in surprise and almost dropped the iron on her perfectly ironed snow-white shirt. This is always like this, she thought with quiet irritation as she carefully set the iron aside. "Can't wait a second." "I'm on it now," Annie said, taking one last hard look at her creation. The shirt was perfect, without a single crease. "Hurry up, or I'll be late for Matthew's wedding," her husband interrupted her thoughts. "You know how important it is." Matthew. Annie frowned at the thought of her husband's boss. Strange, after all, that she hadn't been invited to this wedding. For as long as she could remember, the owner of Vertical had always treated the spouses of his colleagues and partners with special respect, and considered it an honor to get acquainted with their families. And suddenly it was such an embarrassment. Annie sighed and carried the shirt into the bedroom. Nick impatiently snatched it up, put it on in a flash, buttoned it, and scurried around the bedroom, trying to grab his cufflinks and find a second sock at the same time. Apparently it was hiding among the laundry in the dresser. "The only thing keeping our firm afloat is our partnership with Vertical," he continued, trying unsuccessfully to get his feet into his shoes, which were swollen from the heat. "If it weren't for Matthew and his orders, would we be building half a city? We'd be scraping by like we did under your father, wouldn't we? I'm glad I thought of the idea of taking a share in the holding company. But of course it's your firm." Dreary, Annie thought, scrutinizing the lapels of his jacket. "It was Dad's a while ago, and now it's yours." Her father could have left the business to her. "It's not a woman's business," said her father later, knowing that he had not long left, and made a will in favor of his son-in-law. "They say that a woman's business is to give birth to children and cook borscht. And if you work, then is she a lawyer?" However, and the construction itself was not interested in her. It's like her work in a flower shop. She smiled dreamily, remembering the smell of fresh roses and carnations, the rustle of wrapping paper, and the delight in the eyes of customers. She loved flowers, felt them as if they were alive. The plants seemed to reciprocate her love. In her hands they remained fresh and beautiful longer. Under Annie's careful guidance, not only her humble business flourished, but also the flowers in the store. Finally, Nick managed with his shoes, and looking at himself meticulously in the mirror, reached for his tie. He tried unsuccessfully to tie it a couple of times, but his hands were shaking with excitement. He looked helplessly at his wife. "Annie, will you help me here? It's not working today, I'm worried." "All right, I'll help you." She stepped toward her husband, deftly straightening the unruly silk of his tie. Her fingers habitually slid over the fabric, remembering the intricate weave of the knot. Meanwhile, her gaze moved involuntarily to her husband's neck, to that spot just below his ear where the skin was especially tender. Annie's heart skipped a beat. There, on the swarthy skin, a small bruise was clearly darkened. A bright, eloquent, unmistakable hickey. The sudden realization burned her, and her temples rattled and her throat went dry. Annie froze without tying her tie, staring at her husband, unable to find the words. Nick frowned incomprehensibly. "What are you doing? What's wrong?" Annie remained silent, feeling an icy rage flooding her. It was as if some gears had shifted in her head, putting everything into one blindingly clear picture. And the understatements, and the late nights, and the strange phone calls. That's it. That's what this was all about. I wanted to scream. I wanted to burst into tears, to vent all the bitterness and resentment raging inside her. But she clenched her teeth and gritted her teeth. "Eddie, you're really late." Nick left, slamming the door, and Annie sank slowly to the edge of the bed. Her head was empty and ringing, her thoughts jumbled. Her gaze wandered aimlessly around the room, clinging to familiar objects, pictures on the wall. Here she was with Nick at the graduation, very young, happy. And here they were at their own wedding. He was squeezing her palm so tightly, looking at her with such love. Was it all fake? Annie squeezed her eyes shut, trying to hold back the tears. After all, how well everything was going. Almost 10 years of soul to soul, and the household together established. And with her difficult character, Nick has always been able to get along. And the firm's business was booming under him. What were they missing? Unless they had children. At the thought of that, Annie's heart clenched painfully again. Yes, she'd always wanted a child, but it hadn't worked out yet, even though they'd tried. It was a real misfortune for her, an unhealed wound. I guess it would never heal. Maybe that was it. Maybe Nick had grown cold to her because they didn't have kids. Although Nick never seemed to talk about it, did not express dissatisfaction, and he did not particularly aspire to become a father. He was more into business. Annie pounded her fist on the pillow in frustration. No, this is just unthinkable, she thought. I wonder who this woman is. The sudden thought made her freeze, then jump to her feet. Of course, the wedding. All the answers are there. We must get to the festivities at all costs. Mingle with the crowd of guests and observe her husband. How he behaves, who he hangs out with more. See if we can find out who the separatrix is. The plan was instantaneous. Annie stood up resolutely. She brushed away her tears and headed for the closet. She had half an hour to pack and drive to the restaurant. 15 minutes later, Annie was already rushing into a cab, cursing traffic and red lights. Her thoughts were racing, changing from one to the next. How long had this been going on? Why hadn't she noticed anything before? Was she really that blind? Or was Nick so good at hiding a double life? In the flower shop, Annie chose the most luxurious arrangement of white roses and freesias. This bouquet she was preparing especially for wedding ceremonies, a symbol of purity and new life. Well, it would be good for her impromptu spy mission. Clutching the basket, Annie burst into the restaurant lobby. 2 imposing guards stood at the door to the main room, scrutinizing each entrant. Your invitation, one of them said sternly, blocking the way. Yes, now. Just a second, Annie whispered, pretending to look for the unfortunate piece of paper in her bag, though she knew perfectly well that she had no invitation at all. The bouquet in her hands treacherously wobbled and almost slipped to the floor. Annie picked it up at the last moment, glancing warily at the guard. Come on, he grumbled, taking pity and stepping aside, or you'll drop it. Annie exhaled in relief, giving the guard the most charming of smiles. She stepped resolutely into the chic, festively decorated hall and froze at the entrance, stunned by the music and laughter, blinded by the glow of crystal chandeliers. The huge hall of the restaurant seemed to contain half the city. Richly dressed men and jeweled ladies, waiters in tuxedos, maneuvering between tables with trays, and in the middle of this crowd the bride and groom, accepting congratulations. Except that Annie was not interested in any of this. She had not come here to admire someone else's party. Her gaze frantically searched the room, looking for the only person she needed among the guests, her husband, Nick. He must be here somewhere, she thought. Why wasn't I invited? He just decided to come here with his mistress. Something clenched in my chest. Anger mingled with jealousy and tears came to her throat. But Annie restrained her emotions by an effort of will. Not to make a scene, really. It is necessary to act quietly, inconspicuously, to sneak into the hall, to get lost among the audience, and from there, from hiding, to watch her husband, catch him red-handed, so to speak. She grabbed her flower basket and moved forward, maneuvering through the crowd of guests. No one paid much attention to her. It was just another relative or bridesmaid with a bouquet. Only the waiters were a little wary of her, as if they were afraid that she would not catch them with a bunch of roses. Meanwhile, Annie's heart plummeted. Nick stood near one of the tables, holding a champagne glass in his hand. In front of him, leaning on the table and smiling charmingly, stood a tall girl in a dazzling red dress. Even from afar, it was obvious how good she was. Or rather, a figure skater. Long legs, bright red hair, and a wave that fell to her bare shoulders. Annie felt nausea rising in her throat. No, come on. Not only did he have a mistress, but he'd chosen such a striking beauty. The mere sight of her gives me complexes. How could she, a modest housewife in a simple dress, to compete with this panther? But even more disgusting, even more painful was to watch her husband communicating with his girlfriend. Nick frankly devoured the girl with his eyes, now and then touched her waist, said something, leaning low to the ear. And the beauty giggled coquettishly, brushing away a naughty strand from her face and licking her lips invitingly. All this right in the middle of the wedding hall, in full view of hundreds of people. They had no shame, no conscience. When Nick drew his mistress to him and sank a greedy kiss on her lips, Annie thought she was going to faint. She clutched at the basket of flowers so white her knuckles turned white. She stood there, unable to look away from the kissing couple. Resentment choked her, bitterness eating away at her gut. Anger, despair, a sense of her own insignificance all mixed together, flooding her consciousness. Suddenly something clicked in her head. A stray, crazy thought flashed through her mind. Why, in fact, should she keep silent? Why should she cover for her unfaithful husband, keep his dirty secrets, let everyone know what he really is? Let the whole of this beau monde see his true face. Driven by this idea, she moved forward with determination. The guests and waiters scurried out of her way, staring at her in bewilderment. She did not notice anyone. Her whole being was concentrated on a single goal, the bandstand. There, towering above the hall, stood the musicians, a string quartet, and a singer with a microphone. Just what she needed right now. "Excuse me, can I interrupt you for just a moment?" Annie blurted out, stepping between the dazed soloist and the violinist. Without waiting for an answer, she put her flower basket on the stage and grabbed the microphone. There was a stunned silence in the hall. The audience looked at each other in bewilderment. What kind of amateur act was this? "Ladies and gentlemen," Annie said, her voice ringing with tension. "Can I have your attention, please? I have an important message." The hum of voices died down. Hundreds of eyes turned to her. Annie swallowed convulsively, feeling the blood rush to her cheeks. This was it, the moment of truth. Now she was going to say it all, spit it out. And whatever happens. "I'm here to expose a man," Annie continued, trying to keep her voice firm. "A man who pretends to be a decent family man and a faithful husband. But in reality, he's a liar, a cheat, and a traitor." A hum of surprise swept through the hall. No one yet understood what this excited lady with a microphone was getting at. But it was already clear to everyone something interesting was coming up. "That man is my husband, Nick," Annie shouted, pointing her finger in the direction of her husband's frozen stupor. "There he is standing next to his date. Did you think I wouldn't figure it out? Did you think I'd just sit at home and cook borscht while he went out with women?" Nick jerked as if slapped. His face turned gray. He looked around in a huff. The guests turned their heads in his direction as if on cue. They murmured, pointing their fingers at him. "How dare you," he hissed, taking an uncertain step toward the bandstand. "Annie, shut up right now. You've got it all wrong." "Oh, wrong," she uttered in a whistling whisper, feeling herself being carried away. "How else can you understand that passionate kiss which everybody has just witnessed? It's embarrassing, Nick, and disgusting. What a scoundrel you are, after all." There was an unimaginable uproar in the hall. The guests gasped indignantly. Some were already laughing at Nick's shame. "What do you mean, you misunderstood?" the red-haired beast sarcastically inquired, resting her arms at her sides. "Repeat in front of everyone what you've been telling me, that you're through with your wife, that you haven't slept with her for a long time and you're about to divorce her. And it turns out she doesn't even know. And I was a fool to believe it." She gave him an annihilating look and, turning abruptly, stuttered toward the exit. Nick rushed after her, babbling something inarticulate and exculpatory. The guests laughed harder than before. Suddenly, the music stopped. It became very quiet. A tall, gray-haired man with piercing blue eyes, Matthew, made his way through the crowd, elbowing the guests. He was Nick's boss. When he reached the bandstand, he gave Annie a long, probing look, then turned to Nick, who was frozen in place. "Nick," he said coldly, drilling his subordinate with a searing stare, "we need to have a serious talk. Right now. Let's go outside." Nick, casting a quick glance at Annie, headed resolutely for the exit. Matthew pulled on his jacket and moved to follow. At the door, he turned around and threw Annie a piercing look that sent chills down her spine. "That's it," she thought doomfully. "He's going to kill me now. I can't stay in the same house with him. I must leave at once." She hurried down from the bandstand and, without looking at anyone, hurried to the exit. Her heart was pounding like crazy, her temples were thumping. Hurry, hurry home, pack the essentials and run. If only Nick would stay longer. Annie burst into the apartment, kicking off her shoes as she went. Time was running out. If only she could get everything she needed and escape before he returned. She rushed into the bedroom, pulled a suitcase out of the closet, and frantically began throwing things into it: lingerie, dresses, makeup. Her hands were shaking, her temples were pounding. Just hurry up, just to get away. Documents flew into the suitcase. Annie grabbed her cell phone out of her purse and with shaking fingers dialed her friend's number. "Anastasia. It's me," she blurted out, clamping the receiver between her ear and shoulder while pulling on her coat. "Listen, here's the thing, there's nowhere to spend the night. Will you meet me? I'll explain everything later." "Jesus, Annie, you're scaring me," her friend responded worriedly. "What's the matter?" "Oh, you'll see for yourself. Later," Annie waved away, and picking up her suitcase, rushed to the door. "I'm on my way, wait, thank you." She flew into the elevator. Her fingers trembled finally as she poked at the first floor button. Leaping out of the elevator, Annie raced at full speed toward the road, frantically looking around for a cab. Catching a car, she jumped in. "Where are we going?" the driver asked, eyeing the disheveled passenger appraisingly. Annie dictated Anastasia's address. I leaned back in the seat helplessly. My heart was pounding in my chest like crazy. About 40 minutes later, the cab pulled up in front of Anastasia's house. Annie paid, climbed out of the car, dragged her suitcase to the right entrance, dialed the code. The intercom buzzed, the lock clicked. When she reached her friend's apartment, she rang the bell. The door immediately opened. An anxious Anastasia stood on the threshold in a terrycloth robe and slippers. "Annie, finally. I've been worried sick," she exclaimed, dragging her friend into the hallway. "What's the matter with you? You come on in and tell me." Annie walked into the kitchen and plopped down on a chair. Anastasia immediately rushed to put the kettle on and get out cookies and candy. "Anastasia, I left Nick," Annie muffled, crumpling a paper napkin in her hands. "He's cheating on me. Can you believe he made out with some girl at his boss's wedding? In full view of everyone." Anastasia's eyes went wide. She splayed her hands. "Wow, what an asshole. You caught him at the wedding like that, didn't you?" Annie nodded sorrowfully. "You know, I showed up uninvited, walked in, and he was with some red-headed bitch in his arms. I just freaked out, so I gave them a show. I got on stage and I yelled into the microphone. I was screaming at him, and then I ran away. He went to explain himself to his boss." As Annie told the story, she felt a belated realization come over her. God, what had she done? Disgraced her husband in front of everyone. She'd taken his job. Nick's gonna kill her now. As if in answer to these thoughts, the phone rang shrilly in her purse. Annie glanced at the screen and went cold. Husband. With shaking hands, she pressed the answer button. "You," her husband yelled, barely had she brought the receiver to her ear. "Do you realize what you've done, you hysterical fool? You're the reason Matthew kicked me out of the holding company. He announced in front of everyone that he wasn't working with me anymore. You ruined my business, you bitch." Annie managed to gulp, clenching her teeth. Rage mixed with resentment and fear flooded her mind. "Oh, I'm the bitch," she hissed into the receiver. "And what do you think you are after that? I won't keep quiet while you go to other women." "You've got the wrong one," Annie hissed. There was some mumbling in the receiver. Then there was a distinct click. Nick had disconnected. Annie stared at the phone, feeling tears come to her eyes again. Just then, Anastasia came over to her and put an affectionate arm around her shoulders. "Come on, stop it," her friend said gently. "Well, why are you getting upset because of this rascal? It's nothing. The apartment is yours, the car too, the firm again. You will sue half, and still an alimony will appoint." "He will pay me money." "What alimony, Anastasia? What are you talking about?" Annie grinned bitterly. "It's not like we don't have kids. And you're right about the firm, I don't know how we'll split it. But I'm sure of my rights. Dad left the business to Nick when we were married. So it's jointly owned." The next morning, Annie went to see a lawyer who had been recommended to her by acquaintances, saying he was a master of his craft and would handle everything in the best possible way. Eddie indeed made the most favorable impression. Stately, solid, moderately charming, he listened attentively to the confusing story, asked a few clarifying questions, nodded, made notes in his notebook. "Don't worry, Annie," he summarized, setting aside his pen. "The situation is clear. Legally, you're entitled to half of everything that was gained during the marriage, and apartments and cars and firms. So we're going to take action, assert your rights. We file a lawsuit for divorce and division of property. And that's it. Let's go into battle." Encouraged, Annie left the office. Wow, how lucky she was. She could tell she was a professional. She knows she won't let her down. However, soon strange, one could say, frightening things began to happen. Once, coming out of the entrance, Annie almost stepped on a dead mouse, disgusting, decomposed, clearly lying for more than a day. She squealed in disgust and horror, so much so that dogs in neighboring houses barked and windows flew open. Annie bounced away, clamping her hand over her mouth, feeling nausea rise to her throat. A few days later, a woman sat on a park bench and asked her about children, saying that childlessness was a heavenly punishment and always the fault of the woman. Annie was taken aback at first, then felt rage boiling in her chest. She jumped up and shouted, spitting saliva, "How dare you? This is none of your business. Go away with your advice," and she cried. She ran away out of the way. Sobs burst from her chest. Her legs were tangled. Passers-by frightened away, seeing her with sympathetic and perplexed looks. And then in a cafe, a tipsy guy came to the table and, grinning viciously, put his hands on her plate. Annie was taken aback, outraged, and the boar just smirked and climbed. Unable to stand it, she grabbed the dish and threw it in the cheeky man's face. He howled and jumped up, swearing at her. Annie stormed out of the cafe, trembling with indignation. What the hell is this? Are all the people around here crazy or what? The worst was ahead. The day of the trial had arrived. She sat in the corridor, a ball of nerves, in a sweaty robe, fumbling with a paper handkerchief. Eddie, important and trim, was discussing something softly with his assistant. When Annie was invited into the courtroom, she was stunned to see Nick sitting at the defendant's table, a polished, secure, self-assured man. Next to him, cross-legged, sat Carla, the same red-headed divorcee. Catching Annie's gaze, she grinned triumphantly. In court, a stern, middle-aged lady coughed and announced in an official tone, "This is a case for dissolution of marriage and division of property between Swan Annie and Swan Nick. Plaintiff, please." Annie rose timidly and began to outline her demands in a confused manner. But before she could turn around, Nick jumped up and, eyes flashing, blurted out, "Your Honor, what divorce? My wife doesn't need freedom, she needs medical attention. Take a look for yourself." With those words, he pulled several sheets out of a folder and shook them in the air. "Here's a videotape of her tantrums. Here are doctor's notes. My wife is sick. She doesn't realize what she's doing. She needs treatment." Annie's eyes darkened. The videotapes? Certificates? What was this about? She felt her tongue stick to her palate, her temples thudded, and her chest felt like something had collapsed. "I don't understand," Annie whispered. "What hysterics? What certificates? It's all lies." The judge pressed her lips together. "We'll check it out. Please put the recording on the screen." The secretary fiddled with a laptop and a projector. Annie watched his actions with bated breath. Finally, a slightly trembling image appeared on the white wall of the hall. Annie gasped. From the screen, she was looking at herself. There she was, coming out of the entryway, suddenly stopping abruptly. With a shriek, she bounced aside, a shrill scream, almost animalistic, her face contorted with horror. The hall rumbled with murmurs. Annie felt the heat rush to her cheeks. Wow, how loudly she had screamed over a dead mouse. It looked like a psychopath from the outside. Next came the footage from the park. Annie's sitting on a bench. An auntie comes over with a bag of breadcrumbs and starts feeding the pigeons. She says something, smiles good-naturedly. Suddenly, Annie jumps up, screaming, waving her arms, sputtering. Her face is twisted with rage. The aunt recoils. Annie gets a chill inside. So that's it. These encounters were no coincidence. She was being deliberately provoked and pissed off, and she'd been stupid enough to fall for it. But the worst part was the cafe. Annie's sitting at a table, picking at her plate. Some guy comes up to her. And in the next shot, Annie jumps up and throws her plate right in his face. There was a collective sigh. The judge smirked meaningfully and turned off the tape. In the ensuing silence, her voice sounded especially weighty. "What do you say, plaintiff?" It happened. Annie felt the ground slipping from under her feet. Only now she realized the horror of the situation. After all, these tapes really make an impression. From the outside, her reaction seemed wild, inadequate, as if she were really out of her mind. She looked helplessly at the lawyer. He sat stone-faced and studiously avoided meeting her gaze. Annie felt her heart sinking into her stomach. Was it really over? Was she really going straight to the note house? "It's not what you think," she said weakly, her voice trembling. "I'm not crazy. I'm just nervous. But who doesn't?" The judge raised her eyebrows skeptically. "Don't get too excited." Annie looked meaningfully at the bailiffs. "Well, we'll deal with it. We're adjourned. Please come to the deliberation room." Annie entered the office on shaky legs. Eddie came in next, looking as gloomy as a cloud. He sank heavily into the chair across from her, fingers interlocked. "Annie, here's the thing," he began. "It seems to me that your husband would do anything to have you declared incompetent. These certificates, videotapes, they look fake, of course, but the court will take at face value. There's almost no chance to argue, to fight back." "What do you mean?" Annie's voice trembled. "What about my rights? You promised." The lawyer wrinkled his nose, spread his hands. "I'm doing what I can. But if he really puts you in the asylum, to the division of property, and will not come, I'm afraid the only way out is to withdraw the suit before it's too late." Annie felt the floor slipping away from under her feet. But how could she? She'd walk away with nothing. Nick would get everything. Tears came to her throat. Her eyelashes quivered. Gritting her teeth, she nodded. There was no other choice. When the court was called to order, Annie stood up and spoke hoarsely. "Your Honor, I'm withdrawing the suit. I ask that this case be dismissed." There was a murmur of surprise. Nick grinned triumphantly. The judge shrugged her shoulders. "Well, since the plaintiff withdraws, the case is dismissed. Thank you all. All dismissed." Annie staggered to the exit. Her head was spinning. How could this be? Why had everything turned against her? After all she had hoped and believed. Having opened the heavy doors of the court, she froze on the threshold in confusion. Standing on the steps with their backs to her were Nick, Carla, and Eddie himself. They were talking animatedly, laughing, patting each other on the shoulders. "Eddie, you're a genius," Annie heard Carla's low, chesty voice. "How cleverly you tricked her. You had her fooled." And she believed Smith. Annie felt the ground slipping from under her feet. Oh my God, that's it. That's why the lawyer didn't even try to put up much of a fight. They'd all been in on it, planned and played it out. Blinded by tears, Annie flung herself down the stairs. Nick turned around, gave her a wary look, and grinned cynically. "What, you ate it? Did you like the way your whimsy was thwarted? That's half your property. You're out of here." Sobbing and stumbling, Annie ran to the cab. She collapsed on the seat, sobbing and choking on her tears. Her head was pounding. Her eyes were blurring. No, this can't be happening. It's a dream. A delusion. A nightmare. Now she'll wake up and everything will be fine. It wasn't her. It wasn't about her. But Annie knew, alas, it was true. The cruel, merciless truth. Her husband had betrayed her lawyer had cheated her, and she was left broke. No money, no roof over her head, no hope for the best. At 6, Annie arrived at Anastasia's house. She burst into a flood of tears. Choking, confused, she recounted the whole terrible day, the trial, Nick and Carla's meanness, and the lawyer's betrayal. "Anastasia, what am I going to do?" she sobbed. In despair, Annie asked, crumpling the handkerchief wet with tears. "I have nothing else. Not even a house." Her friend hugged her, looking into her eyes. "What's wrong with you? Come on, pull yourself together. We'll get through this. You're strong. You'll get through this." Annie grinned bitterly through her tears. "Easy for me to say. How can you go on living when the whole world is against you? The husband was a scoundrel. The divorce has become a laughingstock, and at work is about to be fired. Who needs a scandalous celebrity with a tarnished reputation?" And that's exactly what happened. A couple of days later, Annie was called to her by the owner of the store and asked to resign at her own request. Annie wasn't even surprised. She had expected it. When she returned home to Anastasia, she collapsed on the couch, staring at one point, trying to realize that there was nothing to keep her in her hometown. Just memories of the past. You have to leave this place, or you'll go crazy. Anastasia glanced at her friend, biting her lip nervously. It was obvious that she had a thought brewing in her head, too. Finally, she decided. She sat down and put her arm around her shoulders. "Listen, what if? My grandmother's house in my village is empty. Grandma died last year. May she rest in peace. And the house is big, nice. Maybe we could go. At least for a while. You'll be distracted, come to your senses, and then we'll see." Annie raised her head and looked at her friend with wide-open eyes. "To the country? Anastasia, you're a genius." She hugged her friend tightly. "I can't think of anything better. I'll go away. I'll forget everyone. It would really be easier that way." Without wasting any time, they started packing. In a couple of days, Annie got off the bus on the outskirts of a small village and breathed a full breath. The air was surprisingly fresh, filled with the aroma of herbs. After the city smog, it was incredibly easy to breathe. "I'm starting a new life," Annie thought to herself as she made her way toward the low hedge, behind which stood a good-sized house. Her childhood home, as Anastasia had said. This was where her best years had been spent. It had always been peaceful and good. At first, Annie felt a little foreign, lost. It was unusual to wake up to the crowing of roosters instead of the noise of cars. She was surprised by the clean streets and the friendly faces of the locals. People here lived in a measured way, without fuss and haste. A couple of days later, coming back from the store, Annie noticed that a short figure in a colorful scarf was waiting for her at the gate. When she came closer, she saw a wrinkled but surprisingly friendly face. "Hello," Annie said respectfully. "Are you here to see me?" Grandmother smiled. "And good health to you, my dear. Let me introduce myself, Rosalie. Your neighbor. I thought I'd stop by and meet the new resident. Then again, you're a city girl, aren't you?" She gave Annie an attentive look. She was embarrassed. The eyes of her grandmother were very penetrating, as if they looked into her soul. "Well, come in. We'll sit and drink tea." At the table, the neighbors got to talking. Annie, without knowing why, suddenly told Rosalie her whole story about her failed marriage, about her husband's betrayal, about her ruined life. Her grandmother listened attentively, without interrupting. Only from time to time she clucked her tongue and shook her head. "Oh, you've been through a lot," she sighed when Annie had finished. "But don't despair. Life is like that, where there's a fall, there's a rise. Mark my words." Her grandmother's words were like a balm to a wounded soul. Annie smiled gratefully through her tears. For the first time in a long time, she felt somehow light and calm, as if all these terrible months had never happened. Meanwhile, the neighbor finished her tea and resolutely slammed her palm on the table. "Do you have any profession? What have you been doing?" Annie hesitated. "I'm a florist. I worked in a flower store." Rosalie's eyes sparkled with a sly twinkle. "Well, that's perfect. Farmers are always looking for someone to tidy up their greenhouses. There's a shortage of agronomists. And you're good at that, aren't you? That's good." The next morning, Rosalie herself brought Annie to the owner of the largest farm in the area, introduced her as his protégé. They say in flowers and plants knows a thing or two. The farmer looked at Annie's slim figure with distrust, but did not contradict her grandmother. He took Annie on probation, and a new life began. From morning till evening, Annie worked in the greenhouses, tending to the seedlings, watching the soil and fertilizers. She tried her best not to fail. Gradually, the farmer, seeing her diligence, began to treat her with respect. Annie got used to the new place, began to come to her senses. In her vegetable garden also started beds, planted flowers, and in the evenings waited for Rosalie. Her neighbor often dropped by for tea, bringing homemade cakes and snacks. They sat and chatted about everything. For the first time in a long time, Annie felt that she was not alone, that she had someone close to her again. She was walking along the river, deep in thought, when suddenly she noticed some movement on the bridge. Looking up, Annie was horrified. On the very edge, dangerously balancing, stood a wheelchair. A young man was sitting in it and seemed about to throw himself down. "Stop, don't." Annie shouted as hard as she could and dashed toward the bridge. The man flinched, turned around. Annie ran toward him, grabbing the armrest of the stroller. "What are you doing?" Annie exhaled, trying to catch her breath. "How can you do this? Life is such a gift." The man grinned bitterly. Annie stared at his face, handsome, masculine, but very sad. "A gift for some people, maybe. But I'm a cripple. No one wants me. Even my fiancée ran away when she found out I couldn't walk anymore. Annie's heart ached. Poor, miserable man. What grief had befallen him? "Come to my place," she suggested softly. "We'll have tea and talk. My name is Annie. And you?" "Benjamin," he answered quietly and nodded uncertainly. At home, Annie gave the guest hot tea with herbs. She served him fresh cakes and listened to his sad story. It turned out Benjamin was the stepson of a local farmer. His mother died many years ago. His stepfather brought him up as his own. 6 months ago, Benjamin was in a terrible accident, damaged his spine, and has been confined to a wheelchair ever since. His fiancée ran away immediately. She says, "I'm a burden now," he grinned bitterly. "There is no money for treatment and will not be. What use am I now? I'm just taking up space." "How can you be so heartless?" Annie covered Benjamin's hand with her own and squeezed it affectionately. "I understand you very well. I've just lost my husband and my home, and I'm barely out of it. You know how painful and scary it was. But nothing will get through it. The important thing is not to give up." Tears glistened in Benjamin's eyes. Annie's words seemed to have reached his heart. From that day on, they spent a lot of time together. Annie helped Benjamin learn the stroller. She walked with him around the neighborhood, and they talked a lot, sharing their innermost thoughts. It turned out that Benjamin was a veterinarian by profession. He always liked to take care of animals, especially horses. Before the accident, he was involved in equestrian sports and even competed in competitions. But now, confined to a wheelchair, he could no longer travel around the farms. However, the villagers still came to him for advice about their animals. One day on a walk, Annie and Benjamin suddenly heard a faint, pitiful squeak. They turned off the path and found a tiny puppy. The poor thing was floundering in a muddy ditch. Someone must have thrown it away. Annie jumped into the ditch and picked the little dog up in her arms. The little one was trembling, clutching his paw. She made her way to the road and carried the puppy to Benjamin. "Benjamin, you poor thing. It looks like it's broken." Benjamin frowned, groping the puppy gingerly. "He needs a splint and antibiotics, or he'll get an infection." He gave his orders so confidently and calmly that Annie couldn't help but admire him. Here was a doctor, albeit an animal one, a talent, she could tell. She decided to take the puppy with her. Benjamin explained in detail what to feed, how to treat the wound, and give medicine. They named him Chip. They worked with the puppy together. Benjamin came every day, bringing meat scraps and special food. He taught Annie how to train and care for the dog. But one day, Benjamin arrived, gloomy as a cloud. Annie immediately noticed his bad mood. He didn't even smile when Chip rushed to lick his hands. "What's the matter?" she asked anxiously, coming closer. Benjamin sighed heavily, averting his eyes. "My stepfather is eating my brains out. He says he shouldn't mess with you. He says you're a foolish woman, a city girl, and a poor one at that. And he wants a daughter-in-law who works hard, has money, so that she could take care of me, an invalid." Annie just pressed her lips together. "I can't believe the village gossip and gossip. How Galia wants to poke her nose into other people's lives. I bet he's no angel himself." "Don't mind her," she said soothingly, stroking Benjamin's tense shoulder. "Your stepfather's just worried about you. That's why he's nagging. He's used to being in control, and I'm the dark horse, the one who doesn't understand. That's why he's angry." Benjamin grinned wryly and put his hand on hers. "I know how he feels," he said. "I've heard him talk about it all the time." "What kind of words does he say about you?" Benjamin just waved his hand and didn't answer. "He'll get over it somehow, as long as you're around. We can handle the rest," Annie said. "Don't worry about it," she smiled, kissing him on his unshaven cheek. "The stepfather will get over it and calm down." Where will he go? And you and I are always on each other's side." That's right, Benjamin glowed and pulled her to him. Hugged her as tightly as if he was afraid of losing her. "Right?" he whispered, his face in her hair. "You're the only one I have left. Don't leave me." "Okay, I won't," Annie promised firmly. "I'm sure I won't now." Annie saw Benjamin off and returned to the house with a sigh. She felt uneasy. No matter how brave she was in reassuring Benjamin, her stepfather's words sank into her heart. Fortunately, there was a knock at the door. Rosalie stood on the doorstep with the usual pies and news. "Hello, darling," Annie sang as she came into the house. "What have I brought?" "Cabbage and mushrooms. I just baked it myself." "Oh, thank you." Annie gratefully accepted the bundle, carefully putting it on the table. "You sit down and I'll put the kettle on." Over tea, they got to talking. Annie decided to share her worries, told about Benjamin, about his conversation with her stepfather. Her eyes filled with tears. "I don't understand," she sighed, rubbing her napkin in her hands. "What did I do to him? Why did he dislike me so much?" Rosalie only waved her hand and shook her head. Oh, my dear. You should have known the passions of that family. I remember when Benjamin's mother, the late Grace, and Helia Swan had been friends since high school. The whole neighborhood was wondering when they were going to get married." Annie was silent. She stirred the sugar in her cup thoughtfully. Then she looked up at Rosalie with moist eyes. "But it turned out differently," Rosalie went on. "Grace went to town to study and came back with a belly. She wouldn't say who the father was, wouldn't admit it. She only said she'd made a mistake, so don't judge her harshly." Annie gasped. "Was it Benjamin?" "That's right," Rosalie nodded. "An illegitimate son. A sin, you might say." "Did Helia Swan marry her anyway?" Annie asked in amazement. "I thought he'd just adopted a child from his first marriage." "Where could he go? He loved her dearly. Forgave her. But they weren't happy for long. Grace died soon after. Galia was left alone with the children. He didn't give them to the orphanage, afraid of people's gossip." Rosalie sighed thoughtfully. "So he raised his stepson as his own. But there was no real love in him. Benjamin was so much like his mother. Every day reminded him of her sin, of her deceit. That's why he doesn't love the city." Thanking Rosalie for the story and the pies, Annie sat deep in thought. "It's not easy for Benjamin. Oh, not easy. He doesn't know his own father and he's not getting on well with his stepfather. It's like he's climbing the walls." As if in answer to her thoughts, there was a knock at the gate. Benjamin stood on the doorstep, gloomy, confused, with a faded look in his eyes. He began, averting his eyes. "Can I stay with you for a while? I've lost my life. My strength is gone." Annie's heart sank. Had Helia gone completely mad? Had the boy really gone mad? "Jesus, Benjamin, what are you talking about?" She splashed her hands, stepping aside. "Sure, live as long as you want, there's plenty of room." As she put her arms around Benjamin, she felt him tremble with excitement. She was suddenly so bitter and hurt for him. It's not fair. Oh, so unfair. The next few days passed quietly and peacefully. Benjamin wanted to help with the household chores, worked on the car. It was like being back in his own home, but there was still a sadness in his eyes. And then the unexpected happened. Nick called. His voice was shaky and broken. Annie didn't even immediately recognize her ex-husband. "Annie, help me," he literally begged. "I'm broke. Things are really bad. After Matthew kicked me out of the holding company, the partners started to scatter. They're afraid to do business with me. You know your father had connections. They respected him. If you ask, they'll help me. For your sake, for his memory, Annie froze, clutching the phone frantically. That's news. So Nick was in a hot place, running to her. And not so long ago, he'd trampled her into the dirt and considered her an enemy. I wanted to hang up, to refuse, but something stopped me. All right, she said slowly. Come over and we'll talk. Nick came the very next day. There was more gray in his hair. Annie looked at him and didn't recognize him. Where had the smug rich man gone? A broken and lost man sat before her. Annie, I'm so sorry for you, he began, biting his lip. I don't know what came over me. It's the devil. I'm so sorry, please. Annie raised her hand, cutting off the flow of his words. Never mind. What's past is past. Tell me, what can I do for you? Nick breathed out a sigh of relief and began to tell, and Annie listened, nodding. The plan was indeed a good one. She would contact her late father's partners, put in a good word for her ex-husband, and they might lend a hand. There was just one thing that made her uneasy. It was too easy. Nick is humiliated, begging, and she is so kind and unresponsive, forgives and helps. No, it doesn't work like that. Annie's not a charity. I'll help, Annie said firmly. Nick brightened, stepped forward. Annie gestured for him to stop his excitement. Only I'll have a condition. Anything. Nick exclaimed fervently. I'd do anything for you. Annie grinned. I wonder how he'll sing when he hears. Benjamin needs surgery, Annie said without hesitation. It's expensive. He won't get back on his feet without it. Pay for it. And I'll talk to his father's partners. Nick's mouth dropped open in amazement. He'd obviously expected anything but this. Benjamin? Who's that? Wait, is that your new one? It doesn't matter, Annie cut him off. He's a good man, and he needs help. Nick nodded frantically. It was obvious how hard it was for him to stay calm. I get it, he finally exhaled. It's a deal. I'll pay for the surgery. I promise. Annie nodded. Well, that seemed to be one less problem. The hardest part was convincing the old partners, but she wouldn't let them down. She'd do her best to honor her father's memory. That night, lying awake and staring at the dark ceiling, Annie felt a strange lightness, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. It was as if life was beginning to get better. Benjamin slept peacefully beside her. A dog curled up in a ball at her feet. Family, you might say. Nick kept his word. A week later, he arrived, brought the money he needed. Annie counted the money, put it in a safe place. Now she could get on with her ex-husband's business. The negotiations with her father's partners went surprisingly smoothly. She didn't even have to persuade anyone. They gladly agreed to support their dear Annie's husband, albeit the ex-husband. Nick was jubilant, showering her with thanks. It seemed he really was grateful. Annie, meanwhile, was busy with Benjamin's upcoming surgery. Together they called clinics, consulted with doctors. They had to choose the best specialist in the best conditions. Benjamin must get back on his feet, no matter what it took. When the choice was over and the date of the operation was set, Annie reached into the stash for the money and got cold. There was no envelope. She frantically started rummaging through the drawer, turning out the contents, but in vain. The money was gone. Where could it be? Annie muttered, pacing the room. Benjamin, did you take it? Did you put it somewhere else? But he shook his head in confusion. Benjamin hardly ever left the house, and there was no reason for him to touch the money for his own operation. And no strangers came in? Annie asked. No, Benjamin frowned. Only Rosalie dropped by, bringing pies. And my father, when he found out I'd moved in with you. He came so often. He kept apologizing and begging me to come back. Annie was taken aback. Helia? No way. Why would he steal money from his own stepson? But the worm of doubt was already lingering. They had to check it out, find out, or they'd never rest. Benjamin couldn't even find a place for himself. Tormenting himself with suspicion. What if it was true? Why? There didn't seem to be any other options. He plucked up the courage to make a decision. He called Galia and asked her to come over. His stepfather showed up surprisingly quickly, entering the room with a smile, giving Benjamin a fatherly hug. Annie watched him gloomily from the corner of her eye. Here's the thing. Benjamin began cautiously, looking down at the floor. We're missing money, but the money for the operation. Helios sneered back. What are you implying? You think a father would take the last of his son's money? He paused, sniffling angrily, then looked at Annie hard and grinned. I can guess who's been pocketing your money, by the way. Wasn't it your ex-boyfriend, Annie? He's got a knack for it. First he gave me the money to gain your trust, then he was gone. What was his name? He's probably laughing at you right now. You're such simpletons. Annie shuddered as if slapped. Nick? No, it can't be Nick. Or maybe, who knows? Maybe he really is out for revenge. Benjamin stared at his stepfather with his eyes wide open. You could tell by the look on his face that he had doubts, didn't know who to trust. He felt bitter and disgusted. What a nightmare. Suspecting each other, looking for someone to blame. What had they come to? She rose abruptly and took Benjamin's hand firmly in hers. Enough, her voice trembled with tension. It doesn't matter who stole it. What matters is that there's no hope for the operation. We'll have to find another way out of this. Helios wanted to object, but Annie gestured for him to stop. All that was needed was more accusations and excuses. He and Benjamin sat in silence all evening. Each was thinking about his own thoughts, wondering how to go on. Annie was biting her lip, her mind reeling with random thoughts. They needed money, they needed it badly. But where could I get that kind of money? It was like begging for alms. Benjamin suddenly slapped his knee, and Leon grimaced. Listen, what if we record a video on the internet, post it? Maybe people would respond and help. Annie blinked. Wow, how simple it was. And there's a way out. So, shall we tell how we were robbed? She asked hesitantly. Like we're victims of fraud or something? Benjamin shook his head. No, not like that. He rubbed his chin thoughtfully. We'd rather tell you how we live in the village. About the hardships, about what it's like for a disabled person without facilities, so that people would get a sense of it, see what real life is like. Annie nodded slowly. Benjamin's words made sense. A story like that could really stick. Then again, they wouldn't have to feel pity. We just decided to share it the way it was. It didn't take long to get down to business. Benjamin took pictures on his phone and Annie chose her words. They told each other honestly about themselves, about the village, about their difficult fates. Benjamin even brought Leon into the picture, just to make them feel better. When the first video was uploaded, both of them lurked, afraid. What if it didn't work out? They'd be laughed at and misunderstood. But the fears were in vain. After a couple of days, the video began to gain views. There were likes and comments. People asked how to help, offered to donate money for the operation. Annie and Benjamin decided to keep going. They filmed everything: how they organized the house, how they dug in the garden, how they baked pies with Rosalie. Subscribers to the channel grew. Slowly, the advertising began. There was a glimmer of hope. What if it really works? What if they could raise the money themselves? Gradually, the idea turned into a real business. Village stories, as they called their channel, became popular. Annie and Benjamin were recognized, written to from all over the country. But most importantly, the money for their treatment did trickle in. Not much yet, not enough. But with each passing day, the cherished goal grew closer. Now he and Benjamin didn't just hope, they believed, knew, and realized that they could do it, no matter what it took. Get him back on his feet. After all, so many people believed in them. So many stranger friends wished them well. In a couple of hours, he was already entering the modest village house. He was met on the threshold by a dumbfounded Annie. She obviously hadn't expected to see Matthew, the man at whose wedding she had recently caused a huge scandal by exposing her unfaithful husband. "Matthew," Annie whispered, nervously tugging at the hem of her sweater. "You were the last thing I needed. But how?" He took a quick glance around the modest surroundings and fixed his gaze on Annie. "Hello? You weren't expecting me? I didn't think fate would bring us together again under these circumstances." He strode resolutely into the room. He stopped in front of Benjamin, who was frozen in his wheelchair. He looked at the stranger with astonishment, tall, commanding, and obviously not of the ordinary sort. You could smell the influence and money from a mile away. "Benjamin, this is Matthew." Annie broke the awkward silence. "My ex-boss's ex-boss, the man at whose wedding I'd caused the very scandal with the disclosure. Remember I told you about it?" Benjamin nodded. "Of course I do. But what is this Matthew doing here?" As if he'd read his thoughts, the guest lowered himself into the chair opposite and, keeping his gaze fixed on the boy, said, "I saw your video, Benjamin. The one where you talk about yourself, about your childhood, about your mother." Benjamin frowned. What did his commercials have to do with it? What did this capital city tycoon care about his life? But Matthew leaned forward and stared at his companion's face, as if searching for the features he alone knew. "You see, Benjamin, when I saw you on the screen, when I heard your story, it was like something clicked in my head. You look so much like me, so subtly like me in my youth." Benjamin was taken aback. What is this guy getting at? Was he out of his mind? That's ridiculous. "You mentioned that you were from around here," Matthew continued, "that your mother's name was Grace. How old are you?" "I could not come. I had to see you to make sure." Annie, who had been standing silently at the window, suddenly gasped, putting her palm to her mouth, eyes wide. "Matthew, you mean?" He looked up at her and nodded slowly. "Yes, exactly. There's a good chance that Benjamin is my son, the product of my youthful love. I dated his mother when I was in college. Then she disappeared, and I knew nothing about her pregnancy." Benjamin's ears rumbled. He tried to jump up, but his legs felt like absorbent cotton. "Matthew is his father? He couldn't be." "I understand your condition," he said softly, holding out a crumpled envelope. "This is a letter from the lab. I need your sample to run a DNA test. I'm sorry to be so abrupt." Benjamin tore open the envelope with shaky hands. Inside were forms, test tubes, cotton swabs. "So you want me to?" Benjamin, Annie called timidly, moving closer. "Maybe you want to think about it. It's such a... But Benjamin just waved it away. What's there to think about when you're offered the clue to your life? Something you've dreamed of but never dared hope for. "And I agree," he said hoarsely, and reached out for the cotton wand. "Let's do it right now." Matthew exhaled in relief. The procedure took a couple minutes. The businessman stood up, gave Benjamin a long, piercing look. "Thank you," he said softly. "I really hope you. Well, I hope for the best. I'll let you know when the results are in." He moved toward the exit, turned around on the threshold, hesitated. "One more thing. I'll pay you anyway, but if it's confirmed, Paternity, you'll have everything you need. I promise. The DNA results came back a week later. Benjamin opened the envelope with shaking hands, afraid to believe what was happening. But the numbers and graphs didn't lie. There was a 99.9% chance of Matthew's paternity. Almost 100% hit. As Benjamin stared at the paper, his eyes blurred. Father. He had a father, a real, living father, not the alien, frowning Helia, but his own. He wanted to scream from the overflowing emotions. Of course, it was impossible to hide such news. Rumors spread through the village with cosmic speed, and the first to show up on the doorstep was Galia. Angry as hell, his face twisted with greed. You bastard. He attacked Benjamin from the doorstep. Not only did you live on my money for so many years, but you got yourself a rich father. What am I, a redhead? Give me a dime, Benjamin, for your upbringing, for your food. Or I'll take you to court. Benjamin just flapped his eyes, dumbfounded by the sudden onslaught. But Matthew intervened. He had just arrived at his son's house to discuss the surgery scheduled for the next few days. Come on, dear, he said calmly. What alimony? What for? I raised him as my own, said Helia. He doesn't want to know me now, the ungrateful bastard. Matthew raised an eyebrow skeptically, pulled some papers out of a folder. Don't be so proud of yourself, Galia. I've already done my research on you. I know how you go into town every weekend, playing the slot machines. Galia's jaw dropped with anger and embarrassment. I had nothing to say. Caught you, brought you out in the open. He was all Benjamin could squeeze out. Benjamin and Annie, sitting next to him, were shocked. So it was Helia who took that money after all. Gambling addiction. Wow. Matthew's already gone further afield. You can shut your firm down, Galia. It's going to go under the hammer for gambling debts anyway. You owe a lot of money. I was thinking I'll buy out your farm and I can send you to get treatment for your addiction. I know a good dispensary. The farmer's jaw dropped at this turn of events. He grumbled and sold Matthew's farm and went to get treatment for his gambling addiction. And Benjamin and Annie got wings behind their backs. The operation was a success, and the boy was back on his feet. Soon they had a modest but heartfelt wedding. Matthew shone with happiness, embracing his son and new daughter-in-law. And Benjamin and Annie began a new life together. Benjamin got stronger after the operation and went to work on the farm, gradually reviving the farm. Annie took over the household chores, and in her spare time she continued to develop her video blog. She shared with subscribers village everyday life, told about the simple joys of rural life. Their joint channel was gaining popularity day by day. At the same time, a completely different story was unfolding in the city. Despite the support of Annie's father's former partners, Nick's business was going downhill. Like a house of cards, deals fell apart, partners scattered. But it was Carla who was responsible for his downfall. Sensing that the cash flow had dried up, she began to siphon off Nick's last savings. Expensive gifts, luxurious restaurants, travel by all rights and wrongs, cunning mistress emptied his pockets. And when she realized that there was nothing more to take, simply ran away to another, more promising sponsor. Overnight, Nick was left with nothing. And at some point, he remembered Annie. Having gathered drunken courage, he showed up to her with an unexpected proposal to start from scratch. I'm sorry, Nick, but it's too late. Annie shook her head, looking at her ex-husband with quiet sadness. I have my own life now. A new family, and you need to find your own way without me. Nick staggered to the door, sighed heavily, and wandered away, unable to find anything to object to. Benjamin and I were just getting started, she smiled. Madison was waiting for her husband to come home from work, cooking dinner. But when she opened the door, she was heartbroken to see me for. Madison was in the kitchen cooking dinner. She was enjoying what she called family time. "Madison, when are we having dinner?" Looking into the kitchen, asked Richard, the girl's fiancé. "A couple more minutes and everything will be ready." Madison smiled. "I can't wait," the young man muttered. He sat down at the table and watched the bride's manipulations. "If someone had helped me a little, we would have had dinner a long time ago," Madison jokingly told him. "What are you implying?" Richard was indignant. "Nothing," she stroked the young man's hair. "I was just saying that if you had helped me in the beginning, everything would have been ready long ago." "I'm not just sitting at home, by the way," Richard pouted. "I'm developing a cool program that will cost a lot of money. That's why I don't have time to do housework. And that's the kind of thing a girl should be doing." "I know," honey. Madison kissed her fiancé on the cheek. At that moment, the doorbell rang. "Who the hell is this?" Richard asked in surprise. "You know I don't have the gift of foresight," she joked. But when she met her fiancé's stern gaze, her playful mood disappeared. "I'll get it," Richard said grudgingly and left the table. It so happened that the young man was by nature an introvert, and uninvited guests were like a bone in his throat. When Richard opened the door, he was startled. Standing before him was his cousin Oswald. "Richard, hello," he said loudly, entering the flat uninvited. "Oswald?" Richard asked, confused. "Brother, why are you looking at me like that? It's like seeing a ghost." Oswald laughed. "Or are you not happy to see me?" "Of course I am, but..." Richard tried to collect his thoughts. "What are you doing here?" "I decided to move to the city," shrugged his shoulders. "I'm tired of dealing with my own affairs in the village. I want to find a job here, and then a bride." "I see." Richard scratched his head. At that moment, the landlady came out into the corridor. When she saw the guest, she smiled broadly. "Oswald, what a surprise." Madison hugged the young man. "What are you doing here?" "I decided to move to the city," answered the guest. "Oswald, you're just in time. We were just about to have dinner." The girl invited everyone to the table. The evening passed in a relaxed atmosphere. Even Richard, who was not particularly happy about his brother's arrival, got involved in the conversation. Grandpa Travis had caught up with his cow. Oswald finished his story. "Yes, as long as I can remember, Grandpa Travis always had adventures," Richard said. "On the one hand, I love the country," Madison said dreamily. "What's good about it?" Richard wondered. "There's something romantic about it," she smiled enigmatically. The groom looked at his bride with all his eyes. The young man was a city dweller to the core and never understood the romance of the countryside. Nights under the moon, dew on daisies, evening sunsets near the river. A lot, you know. Madison started listing. "Oof," Richard pointed at his fiancée. "And meanwhile, Madison is right," supported Oswald girl. "You can't find that in the city." "All right, brother, it's late," Richard said gruffly. "Where are you staying?" "I'm nowhere." The guest was confused. "What do you mean?" Richard was taken aback. "I thought I'd stay with you for a while." "I'm looking for a job." Oswald shrugged his shoulders. "So to speak, on a kinship basis." "Brother, in your village you can come to visit and stay overnight for a few days," Richard grinned. "But in the city you have to give advance notice of your arrival." "Where am I supposed to go now?" Oswald asked. He was disappointed by his brother's inhospitality. "Richard, it's late tonight, and Oswald can stay with us," said Madison. and tomorrow morning we will look for a suitable option for him. I have one more question for you. Oswald looked at his brother carefully. When can you pay me back my debt? What debt? The girl was surprised. I borrowed money from Oswald more than a year ago to develop a program, Richard explained in a disgruntled tone. What program? Madison squinted her eyes and stared at her fiancé. Isn't it the super program you're still writing? Yes? Richard nodded his head. I see, Madison said, confused. The girl was discouraged. Richard had initially lied to her, saying that it was a program commissioned by a large company. In fact, it turns out that he borrowed the money from his brother a year ago. Now, there are two questions: where to get the money to pay back the debt and how to live on. The next morning, Richard woke up in a bad mood. The arrival of his brother has disturbed his mental equilibrium. Spoilt relations with his fiancée last night because of Oswald's long tongue. Richard had a fight with Madison. Tell me, why did you have to lie to me about your super program? The girl was indignant. I didn't lie. I just didn't tell the whole truth, Richard justified himself. How are you going to pay back the debt? Madison didn't back down. I'll sell the program and pay it off. When will you sell it? When I write it, Richard snapped. And if that never happens? The girl asked. Thank you very much. The young man bowed to Madison, then grinned and said, Riley, I always knew you'd be there for me in a time of need. I'm just realistic about things. The girl looked intently into his eyes. There is a debt to be repaid. I'll pay back the money. Richard got angry. When and why will you pay it back? Why are you bothering me? The young man was indignant. Because I don't want to start my family life with lies and debts, Madison replied. Then no one's keeping you, Richard blurted out. The door is open 24 hours a day. And if you're so mercenary, you're on your own from now on. About the door, I'll think about your offer, especially since it's my flat, she said in a serious tone. And about the separate budget, I agree with you completely. From tomorrow, everyone pays for his own food, utilities, and his own wants. Madison got into bed and turned away from her fiancé. You're welcome, Richard muttered. He was hurt that his fiancé hadn't supported him in his hour of need, but instead had sided with his brother. Memories of last night's quarrel made Richard's mood even worse. Suddenly, a sound from the kitchen alerted the young man. Richard listened. Madison was laughing merrily at Oswald's jokes. This was the last thing he needed. Richard stood up quickly and dressed. What's going on here? Richard stood up quickly and dressed. What's going on here? Madison, who had been laughing, turned away from her fiancé. She silently collected the rest of the breakfast and put it in the fridge. Madison, why did you do that? Oswald wondered. And to feed Richard breakfast. Why is your brother armless? Madison asked snidely. Well, I ran to work, or who will support me? The girl walked past Richard without even looking at him. A couple of minutes later, the young men heard the sound of a door slamming shut. Yes, brother, you've caused me a lot of trouble, Richard accused Oswald. I'm sorry, I didn't know you hadn't told me anything about your fiancé. About your duty, the young man said. I'm sorry, Richard mumbled in reply. Well, that's it, Oswald said, getting up from the table. I'm off. Where are you going? Surprised Richard. Where to? To look for a job? I can't sit on your neck. All right then, Richard rejoiced. The sooner Oswald finds a job, the sooner he'll move out. Good luck to you. After breakfast, Richard sat down to write the program. He switched on the computer, but he still couldn't write a single line. The young man's thoughts kept returning to Madison. No doubt he loved his fiancée, but he was hurt by her lack of confidence in his abilities. Toward evening, Madison and Oswald returned home. The girl immediately went into the kitchen to prepare dinner without even looking at Richard. "Why are you two together?" Richard asked unhappily. He was tormented by jealousy. "I met Madison at the entrance and helped her lift the heavy bags," Oswald explained. "By the way, brother, could you pick up your fiancée from work? You would go to the shop together and buy groceries, so that the girl would not carry heavy bags," Oswald suggested. "We'll sort it out ourselves," Richard muttered. "And why are you always meddling in the wrong business?" "I was just trying to help." Oswald waved his hands. "By the way, I have good news. I found a job at a computer firm." "Thank God," Richard rejoiced. "But that's not all," smiled the guest. "I've made a deal for you, so you'll be starting next week too." "As what?" Richard was stunned. "Who's what?" Oswald smiled even wider. "Software and hardware engineer. You're a computer scientist, by God." "Did I ask you to do that?" Richard asked angrily. "Why do you always meddle where you are not asked?" "I just wanted to help," Oswald explained. "Go you know where with your help?" shouted Richard. "I am so sick of you. Get out of my flat and out of my life, so that my eyes do not see you." At Richard's screams, a frightened Madison ran out of the kitchen. "What's going on in here?" asked the girl. "I found a job for Richard, and he started." Oswald began to explain the situation, but Richard interrupted him. "I told you to stay out of my life." The anger inside Richard just tore him apart. "Brother, you'd better calm down before you have a stroke," Oswald advised in a calm tone, which made Richard even angrier. Richard wanted to attack his brother with his fists, but he was stopped by Madison's shout. "Calm down quickly." The girl clenched her fists in anger. "Richard, have you lost your mind?" "He started it first," Richard complained, pouting his lips. "You should thank your brother for taking care of you." Madison shamed her fiancé. "And you're throwing your fists at him." "Don't mind your own business," she said in a quiet, commanding tone. "All right, now we'll all go to dinner, and afterwards we'll talk and discuss everything." "I'm not going to sit at the same table with him," Richard said in a cranky tone. "You can stay hungry." Madison shrugged indifferently. "It's up to you." Richard had no choice but to accept his fiancée's proposal. The conversation at dinner flowed smoothly. The young men were reluctant to utter words, each thinking about his own. After dinner, all three sat down in the living room. "Now, Richard, it's up to you, of course. But today we have utility bills to pay," Madison said sternly. "Following your suggestion from yesterday, we'll split everything in half." The girl held out the receipts to her fiancé. "Familiarize yourself with what we owe for, and how much we owe. All bills must be paid by the 25th, she said. "Where will I get the money?" Richard was surprised. "Your problem." Madison shrugged indifferently. "But all payments are due on time." "Richard, I'm going to tell you something. Just don't shout," carefully began Oswald. When the young man made sure that his brother listened to him attentively, he continued. "What prevents you from combining work and writing a program? Do you think it's easy?" Richard was indignant. "Not easy," agreed the guest. "But with your brains you can do it." "At least you believe in me," Richard said with a sneer and looked at his fiancée. "Don't look at Madison like a wolf," Oswald advised. "Understand, she is a young girl. She wants a new dress and lipstick. So let her buy it." Richard shrugged his shoulders. "Who forbids her?" And with what money did you think? The guest looked at his brother carefully. All her salary goes to your needs, while you're pretending to be a great genius. Richard opened his mouth to object, but didn't make a sound. Damn it, Oswald was right. Madison, why did you put up with me for so long? Richard asked, dumbfounded. Long ago, you should have kicked me to speed up, so that I found a job. Because I love you, the girl replied quietly. Richard walked over to the girl and hugged her tightly. Forgive me, please, whispered the young man. My ambition closed my eyes to reality. That's right, Madison said. Tears sprang from her eyes. Has the armor of ambition and arrogance of a great genius cracked? I swear I'll work hard to make sure you have everything you want, Richard vowed and kissed his bride. And I'll see to it, smiled satisfied Oswald. Happy Madison looked at her guest and whispered, Thank you. 3 months passed. Richard and his brother worked in a computer firm. Oswald moved into a rented flat. Madison and her fiancé's life began to slowly return to normal. One evening after work, the girl waited for her beloved from work. Today she had a surprise for him. Madison was pregnant. The girl was finishing cooking dinner. The doorbell rang. Honey, did you forget your keys? Madison asked, opening the door. But it wasn't her fiancé standing in front of her. Hello, are you Richard's fiancé? Asked a beautiful girl and smiled sweetly. Yes, Madison was confused. I need to have a serious talk with you, the guest replied and entered the flat. About what? The thing is, Richard and I are in love. Madison was speechless at what she heard. How is that possible? Did her Richard have another girlfriend? But how could that be? After all, her fiancé, he loved her every day when he came home from work. He never once gave her any reason to doubt his fidelity. Yes, Richard is no angel, but to live on 2 fronts. Who are you? Madison asked with difficulty. Her throat was sharply dry, and her tongue refused to listen. My name is Chris, the girl replied arrogantly. She looked Madison over from head to toe with an appraising gaze. And I'm Richard's new love. But how can that be? The landlady mumbled in confusion. Her stomach began to ache from the stress she'd been under. But Madison didn't notice it. The only thought in her head was that her fiancé had betrayed her. Why are you surprised? With a cheeky grin, Chris continued to sneer. A man like Richard needs a bright, spectacular, and beautiful woman like me, not someone like you. What's wrong with me? Madison asked quietly. Well, let's just say you're too plain for Richard, Chris replied defiantly. Let's start with your hair. It's a hairstyle that was worn 20 years ago. The color went out of fashion the year before last. The guest shook her head defiantly in defiance. And your clothes are horrible. How can you dislike yourself so much as to stoop to such a thing? Richard never said anything like that. He's always liked everything, the landlady mumbled confusedly. She suddenly realized that she felt a pain in her stomach. She should kick that girl out so Madison could lie down. Once she calms down, her stomach will stop hurting right away. Of course he won't tell you anything, Chris shrugged. You were the most convenient option for him. What are you talking about? Madison, don't be silly, she laughed. You're convenient. You feed the pigeon and put it to bed. What else does a man need to be happy? No, Madison suddenly shouted. You're all lying. Oh, honey, don't be silly. Chris said cynically. You must realize that a man like Richard will sooner or later get tired of living with a bland woman. He'll want exoticism and new emotions. So he switched to me. There was a spark between us as soon as we saw each other. But Richard, as an honest man, for 2 months could not respond to my feelings. but his love for me won out. Shut up, Madison. I know it's unpleasant to hear the truth, but as they say, it's better to know the truth than to live in ignorance. Get out. The pain twisted Madison. It felt like hot metal was being poured into her stomach. What's wrong with you? Chris realized something bad was happening to Madison. The landlady suddenly turned pale and sweat beaded on her face. Call an ambulance. What am I going to tell them? The guest asked in confusion. I'm pregnant. What? Chris looked at her rival in a daze. But Richard didn't tell me anything about the baby. He doesn't know anything yet, Madison said quietly. She slid down the wall and lay on the floor. She couldn't take the pain any longer. An ambulance. I can't lose the baby. Maybe it's for the best? Chris asked thoughtfully. You'll lose the baby, and you and Richard won't have anything to do. What's going on here? Suddenly there was a loud male voice. Through the pain, Madison recognized the voice as Oswald's. I came to talk to her about Richard and me, Chris said. She was talking fast and rambling. Suddenly she felt sick because she was pregnant. Madison, you're pregnant? Oswald interjected. Call an ambulance. Madison asked with all her might and fainted. Madison woke up in the hospital. There was a metal IV stand with a needle inserted into her right arm. The medication was slowly dripping down the tube. Is there anyone here? The girl whispered. Oh, you've come to your senses. An elderly woman who was lying on the next bed came to life. She pressed the nurse call button. A couple of minutes later, a large middle-aged woman entered the room. Despite her fullness, her movements were quick and precise. Tell me, what's wrong with me? Madison asked. Shush, the nurse said with a smile. Tomorrow morning the doctor will come to see you. He will tell you everything. In the meantime, rest. The nurse examined Madison and left the room. After she left, her roommate came over and sat down on a chair next to her. My name is Mrs. Megan, the woman introduced herself. What's yours? Madison. What a rare name these days, the neighbor smiled. You scared the girls last night. Can you tell me if you know what's wrong with my baby? Quietly asked the girl. What I don't know, Mrs. Megan waved her hand. They brought you in last night and put you here. It was awful to look at you. You were covered in IVs and wires. I see, Madison said. What a fiancé you have. The older woman smacked her tongue as she thought of Richard. Madison's heart clenched. In spite of everything, she loved that bastard. Why do you say that? The girl inquired. How was he here worried about you? You have no idea, Mrs. Megan shook her head. I was just seeing my son off when they brought you in by ambulance. Your husband wouldn't leave your side until the nurse chased him away. Otherwise, he'd have gone into surgery with you. The OR? Madison was dizzy from what she'd just heard. So there was something wrong with her baby if she was in surgery. Maybe that's why the nurse left the bad news to the doctor. And before I went to bed, I looked out of the window. Your fiancé was sitting on a bench, waiting for someone from the medical staff to come out and tell him what's wrong with you, the old woman continued to tell me without noticing the slim appearance of her new neighbor. Already close to night, he left. Can you imagine? Why was Richard here all this time? Doesn't he care about me? If he has another woman? Madison replied, confused. Yes. And he's been here since this morning, the older woman continued. Came to check on you. Are they allowed in here? No, but he talked the nurse into it, Mrs. Megan said in a confidential tone. So she let him in for 5 minutes. When he saw you, he fell to his knees in front of you. Forgive me, says Madison. Madison, you fool. If I'd known you were having a baby, I never would have done this." He said that. The girl was surprised. Word for word. "Here's a cross for you." The old woman crossed herself. "Yes, I believe you, Mrs. Megan." Madison smiled. "What's next?" "He kneels down in front of you, kisses your hand, and cries and cries. And how can he not cry when he's guilty before you?" Mrs. Megan wondered. "Oswald may love you, but what has he done wrong if it's his fault you lost the baby?" "What did you say?" Madison was stunned. "How did I lose the baby?" "Oh, I'm just rambling on." "I'm going for a walk." The older woman quickly got up from her chair and left the room. "Mrs. Megan, wait," shouted the girl. But the neighbor didn't even stop. Tears sprang from Madison's eyes. Despite Richard's betrayal, she wanted this child. The girl had dreamed of a child since childhood. At first she had asked her parents for a brother or sister, but they had stubbornly refused, citing financial difficulties. Madison knew that her parents were lying to her, because their income allowed to give birth and raise at least 2 or even 3 more children. Mom just didn't want to bother with nappies and cradles. She was more satisfied with a quiet life, where she could at any moment pack her things and go on holiday. And her father, who loved his wife madly, indulged her in everything and did not cross her. Then Madison firmly decided that she would have 3 children. And when she found out she was pregnant, she was overjoyed. And now her dream has come crashing down. Suddenly Madison frowned. Why did Mrs. Megan call Oswald her fiancé? Now there were more questions than answers. The girl waited for her neighbor, but she persistently did not return. At that moment, a nurse came in. She deftly gave Madison an injection. All manipulations of the nurse were accompanied by silence. After a couple of minutes, the girl fell asleep. The next morning, when Madison opened her eyes, the elderly neighbor pretended not to notice the girl. "Mrs. Megan, talk to me, please," the girl asked quietly. But the woman persisted in reading her book. A couple of minutes later, a doctor accompanied by a nurse entered the room. "Hello, Madison. My name is Jonathan. I'm your doctor. How are you feeling?" "Doctor, what's wrong with my baby?" Madison asked her question. "Unfortunately, we couldn't save the fetus." The man shook his head. "You were bleeding heavily and we had to save you. There was nothing we could do for your baby." Madison couldn't speak, the lump in her throat preventing her from doing so. "Madison, I realize that what I'm going to say now will not calm you down." The doctor took the girl's hand. "But you're still young. You'll definitely have children in the future. You just need to heal a little now, and everything will be fine." "Promise?" Madison asked hopefully. "I promise," Jonathan answered. After the doctor left, Mrs. Megan sat down next to Madison. "I didn't say those things out of spite," she said peacefully. "It was just something I said without thinking." "Mrs. Megan, you knew from the beginning that I'd lost the baby, didn't you?" the girl said with resentment in her voice. "And you gave me hope to think that it wasn't so bad. I'd been telling myself that I was going to be a mom." "Forgive me, old fool." Tears appeared in the woman's eyes. "I wanted to support you, but it didn't work out. You know, I know firsthand what it's like to lose a child." "You do?" Madison asked interestedly. "Yes, after graduating from the Teacher Training Institute, I was sent to a town near Kansas. I felt the happiest because I was on my own. I was finally out of my mother's control. I came to the town, got a job at the school. It was a lot of work, but it didn't scare me. On the contrary, my enthusiasm was bursting. I spent all day at school, organizing the leisure time of the pupils in addition to lessons." Mrs. Megan stopped talking and turned away from the window. Madison was afraid to move so as not to disturb her neighbor's nostalgia. There was a steel mill next to the school. I once had to accompany my students on a field trip to the plant. We were met at the entrance hall by Charles, the honorary metallurgist, who knew the history of the plant like the back of his hand. He led us through the main shop where steel was cooked. The boys were shown the smelting process. You can't imagine the eyes my children looked at it with. Then we were introduced to the best brigade of the plant and its master, Alex. When I saw him, I immediately realized that I was missing. His smile drove me crazy. As it turned out later, our feelings were mutual. The old woman smiled at her memories. 6 months later, we got married. The whole town was celebrating our wedding. It seemed there was no happier couple in the whole world. We always did everything together. We cooked dinner together, cleaned, did the laundry. And when I realized I was pregnant, I thought I'd go crazy with happiness. One day my husband didn't meet me after school. At first I thought that he was delayed at work, so I went to the factory gate. The closer I got, the more anxious I became. There were people standing around the gatehouse. I could tell something was wrong. Mrs. Megan stood up, went to the bedside table and poured herself a glass of water. The woman's hands were shaking. It was obvious that it still hurt her to remember those events. She was rambling, but Madison understood her perfectly. As it turned out, there had been an explosion at the factory, and several people had been hurt. And Alex was killed, Mrs. Megan said. "Oh my God," Madison whispered in horror, pressing her palm to her mouth. When I got the news, I blacked out. I woke up in the hospital. That's when my roommate told me all about the explosion at the factory and the dead foreman. The most interesting thing is that she didn't even know that I was the wife of the foreman. You can't imagine the colors in which she described it all. And the cherry on the cake was my child, whom I lost. My neighbor told me about it as if her milk had gone sour in the fridge, in passing, by the way. How I screamed. I was sedated so much that it is impossible to imagine. After I was discharged from the hospital, I immediately wrote a letter of resignation. I packed my things and went back home to my mom. I couldn't live in this town where everything reminded me of my beloved husband and our unborn child. "Mrs. Megan, I'm sorry, I was wrong," Madison said guiltily. "I'm the one who should be apologizing to you," the neighbor said with a pleading tone in her voice. "I acted like that tactless old woman." "I'm so ashamed," Madison whispered. "It wasn't your fault at all. You just wanted what was best for me, so that I wouldn't have to go through the pain that you did." At that moment, a nurse came into the room. "Madison, how are you feeling?" she asked. "I'm fine." "Then go out into the lobby." "Why?" Madison was surprised. "Your fiancé is here to see you." Madison sighed heavily. She had made the decision to break up with Richard. Despite her love for him, she couldn't forgive his betrayal, which had resulted in the loss of her child. Madison slowly stood up and headed for the lobby. It was time to start a new life without lies and deceit. She walked slowly down the corridor, mentally reciting to herself what she had to say to Richard. The only thing that confused her was why her ex-fiancé had come to the hospital to apologize, or, on the contrary, to laugh at her for being such a fool. Going out into the lobby, the girl was dumbfounded. Oswald was standing in front of her. Seeing Madison, the man walked quickly towards her. "Madison, hello," Oswald said. "How are you? How are you feeling? What do the doctors say when you will be discharged?" "Stop," Madison said in an orderly tone. "Not so fast, I don't have time to answer all your questions. I'll start by asking you what you're doing here." "What do you mean?" The young man was taken aback. "I came to check on you. I also brought some fruit." Oswald handed Madison a transparent plastic bag containing oranges and apples. "Thank you," Madison thanked her guest quietly. Take, don't be shy," Oswald smiled. "It's my pleasure to take care of you. I know very well how they feed in hospitals. Besides, you need vitamins now." That's true, the girl shrugged her shoulders. She nodded her head and pointed to a bench near the window. Let's go and sit down. Come on, tell me about it, the young man said, sitting down on the bench next to Madison. I feel better now, Madison said quietly. Unfortunately, I lost the baby. The girl was silent. She tried not to cry in front of Oswald. I know. Oswald lowered his head guiltily. It was my fault that it happened like that. Why? Madison jumped up. If I hadn't brought Richard into our firm, he wouldn't have met her, and my brother wouldn't have cheated on you. Oswald, don't blame yourself. Madison took his hand. It's not your fault. What is to be is not to be avoided. You see, if we're not meant to be with Richard, then so be it. Do you really think so? Oswald asked hopefully. Yes, I believe in signs of fate, Madison confirmed. So do not worry. Everything that is done for the best. It's just a shame I lost the baby. I'm getting used to the idea that I'm going to be a mum soon. Don't worry, honey. The young man took the girl's hands in his. You will heal and rest a little now, and you will definitely have children in the future. I hope so, Madison smiled. Madison, my dear, I've wanted to tell you something for a long time. Oswald looked straight into the girl's eyes. You don't need Richard. A girl like you deserves more than that. Oswald, what are you talking about? Madison asked in a daze. My darling, my love. You deserve to be loved, carried in his arms, Oswald passionately whispered. I beg you, forget my foolish brother. Give me a chance to be near you. I love you very much. Oswald, are you crazy? Madison tried to pull her hands out of the iron grip of the guest, but he only squeezed them harder, not giving her the opportunity to get free. Suddenly the girl screamed. You're hurting me. Darling, I'm sorry, please. The young man, without letting go of her hands, began to kiss them. Oswald, let me go. But he, as if possessed by an invisible force, did not hear the girl's screams and continued to kiss her hands. Madison began to resist. She hit a bag of fruit that was lying nearby on a bench, causing apples and oranges to scatter on the lobby floor. What's going on here? Suddenly, a loud male voice was heard next to them, which sounded like a thunderclap in the silence. Oswald blushed in surprise and let go of Madison with a sudden movement. He looked at the tall, formidable man who had appeared as if out of thin air, eyes wide open. I came to check on Madison, Oswald said, stammering. I can see that Jonathan's eyes flashed with lightning. I can also see that the patient doesn't like it. So, young man, your appointment hours are over for today, Jonathan said in a tone that did not tolerate any objections. But Oswald tried to say something to the doctor, but he didn't let him. Should I call security? Jonathan asked icily. I'm leaving, Madison said through gritted teeth. He walked towards the exit, turned round at the door, and said goodbye to the girl. I'll come and see you tomorrow. Don't. Madison shouted, but Oswald didn't even turn round. Yes, Madison, what a fiancé you have. Madison's doctor shook his head in disapproval. Madison looked at Jonathan carefully. Who was he to judge her choice? Oswald is not my fiancé, Madison snapped at him. But this young man thinks otherwise, Jonathan said thoughtfully. I don't care what Oswald thinks. Madison walked past the doctor, heading for the room. He's just my ex-fiancé's cousin. Madison, are you forgetting something? Jonathan shouted after her. What, she asked, turning around. This. The doctor deftly picked up an orange from the floor and threw it to Madison. The girl orientated herself and caught the fruit. I don't need it, Madison smiled and tossed the orange back to Jonathan. No, that's no good, the man said in a jokingly menacing tone. He was about to throw the orange back, but the girl quickly walked over to him and took the fruit. My parents taught me not to throw food around. And you're throwing vitamins, by the way, she scolded the doctor. Madison walked over to the bench where the bag was lying, picked it up and began to pick up the fruit. Jonathan looked at her. Why are you looking at me? She said jokingly. Come on, help me. The man bent down and started picking oranges and apples. The two of them quickly picked up everything that was lying on the floor. When the last orange was left on the floor, Madison and Jonathan reached for it at the same time and their fingers touched. The young men jerked their hands sharply away from the fruit as if they had been electrocuted. Madison looked straight into her doctor's eyes. Suddenly she wanted to disappear into the green pool of Jonathan's eyes, but she quickly averted her gaze so as not to cause more trouble. Madison took the fruit and put it in the bag. Thank you, she said in a quiet voice. You're welcome, the man replied in a husky voice. Now go back to your room. You need to rest. Jonathan turned round and went to his office. Madison stared after him for a long time. What just happened? It must be a surge of hormones after losing a child, she thought. She took the bag of fruit and went to her room. Madison, what took you so long? Mrs. Megan asked. I'm waiting for you. I'm exhausted. Why are you waiting for me? Madison was surprised. Then she handed a bag of fruit to her neighbor. Here's a treat for you. Would you like some company? Oh, thank you. The older woman smiled. Why don't you eat it yourself? Your fiancé brought it for you. You've got it mixed up. It's not my fiancé, it's his brother, the girl corrected her neighbor. What brother? Mrs. Megan was taken aback. I heard him say he was your fiancé when they brought you in. And then he was on his knees in that room begging your forgiveness. Oswald apologized to me for getting Richard a job at the firm where he worked. That's where Richard had an affair with this Chris. Now Oswald blames himself for my losing the baby. Wow, the woman grinned. That's how life sometimes twists and turns. Yeah, Madison agreed. At that moment, a nurse entered the room. Madison, did you have a full house today? The nurse said with a smile. Go. Your fiancé is here to see you again. What fiancé? Mrs. Megan asked, squinting her eyes. Why, do you have lots of them? The nurse asked. No, just one, Madison said. And it was an ex. The girl didn't know what she should do. What if it's Oswald back? The last thing Madison wanted was to see him. What if Richard had a guilty conscience and decided to visit Madison? What's the point of guessing? We'll have to go out and see. Only Madison was a little apprehensive after the ugly scene Oswald had caused today. She didn't want to see him, much less talk to him. Taking a deep breath, Madison walked into the lobby. Richard was standing near the window, looking in. The girl grinned and felt a moment of déjà vu. Exactly an hour ago, she had walked out to Oswald, who was standing looking through that window. Richard, what are you doing here? The girl asked in a harsh tone. What do you mean? Richard was dumbfounded. He walked quickly to the girl and wanted to hug her, but Madison dodged his embrace. Don't. Madison said firmly. I asked you a question. Madison, what's wrong with you? The young man was taken aback. I came to see you. I just got back from a business trip today. I was urgently sent on company business to another city. Oswald was supposed to tell you. Richard, don't make excuses, the girl stood her ground. I know the truth that Chris came to see me, and she told me everything. Told you what? Richard asked in surprise. "You're so good at acting surprised," Madison grinned. "I can't believe how good you are at acting." "Madison, can you explain to me in a human way what happened?" Richard asked demandingly. "Why did Chris come to see you?" "She told me the truth about you two being together and in love." "There must be some mistake." The young man furrowed his eyebrows. "Why is that?" Madison grinned. "Because she and Oswald have been dating for 2 months now and are in a serious relationship." Madison looked at Richard dumbfounded. She was completely confused as to whether Oswald was in a relationship with Chris. Then why had he confessed his love to her today? Madison looked at Richard carefully. "You're not confused about anything, are you?" she asked with a frown. "Madison, do you think I'm an idiot?" The young man was indignant. "The thing is that on Thursday, when I was in the hospital, Chris came to my house and told me that you were having an affair with her. She asked me to let you go to her." "That doesn't make any sense." Richard sat down on the bench. He looked at Madison carefully. "If you didn't know anything about me being in the hospital, how did you end up here?" Madison decided to find out the whole truth. "I came home and you were gone," the young man explained. "I called your phone, but you were off the hook." "Yes, because I blocked you," the girl confirmed. "Why?" "Don't play dumb?" Madison grinned. "But you still haven't answered my question." The girl was determined to get to the truth. "How did you know I was in the hospital?" "I came home, and our beloved neighbor, Mrs. Cassandra, told me in all the colors that you were taken away by ambulance. Do you understand?" "Okay," Madison said. "Honey, tell me what happened to you," Richard asked. "Nothing. Except that my fiancé is cheating on me," she blurted out. "I lost the baby." "Stop." The young man tried to realize the meaning of Madison's words. "What baby?" "Ours." "But why didn't you tell me you were pregnant before?" "I was going to tell you that Thursday when I went into the hospital," Madison grinned. "Instead, I found out about your affair." "How can you not realize that I'm not having an affair with this Chris?" Richard raised his voice. "Don't yell at me." Madison was indignant. "Your brother, by the way, says otherwise," Madison said. "He even apologized. That he introduced you to her." "Oswald?" The young man mumbled confusedly. "But he's lying. I would never cheat on you." "Why would he do that?" Madison cut the young man's speech short. "I don't know." Richard suddenly lost his temper. He walked over to Madison and grabbed her by the shoulders. "Look, I'm not guilty of anything." "I'm hurt." Madison tried to break free of the young man's iron grip. "Let me go." Jonathan walked past the lobby at that moment. He took a quick step toward Richard and pulled him away from Madison. "What kind of day is this?" The doctor looked indignantly at his patient. "Madison, is a hospital a place to get into a relationship?" "I'm sorry," the girl replied, lowering her head. She was embarrassed that Jonathan had witnessed such an ugly scene. It was the second time in one day. What would he think of her now? "Young man," the man said in a firm tone, addressing Richard, "I urge you to leave the hospital. Otherwise I'll be forced to call security." "But I've come to visit my fiancé." "Ex-fiancé," Madison cut in. "Especially ex-fiancé," Jonathan added. "Any questions, please, after you've been discharged from the hospital. Your fiancé has lost a child. She needs to regain her strength both physically and mentally." "Madison, get me off the blacklist, please," Richard asked. "Why?" "So I can at least call you." "Richard, there's no need for that," Madison said tiredly. She was exhausted from the fight with Oswald and Richard. "Get your things and get out of my flat. I'm going to the hospital." "I don't think we need to hurry," Richard said. I'll wait for you and we'll talk about it. You see, I've already made up my mind, and talking about it isn't going to change anything, Madison said. And you're just delaying the inevitable. I'll wait for you, Richard said. He wanted to kiss Madison goodbye, but she wouldn't let him. I'll wait for you at home, the young man said, and left. Jonathan looked at the girl. What kind of strange suitors do you have? The doctor grinned. I'm shocked. Madison walked slowly into the room. She wanted to lie in bed and cover herself so she wouldn't have to see anyone or anything else today. Madison silently walked into the room and got into bed. Mrs. Megan, try as she might, could not get her neighbor to talk. The older woman took great offense at Madison for not saying anything to her. How was the meeting with the next fiancé, thought. But the girl didn't care about her neighbor's feelings. She would have to sort out her own. The girl could not sleep for a long time. She couldn't understand which of the two brothers was lying to her, which of them was pursuing his own advantage, and most importantly, what kind. Madison decided to make a confrontation for all three: Richard, Oswald, and Chris. That this girl has a relationship with one of the brothers, there is no doubt. Just whose side is she playing on? It remains to think of such a situation to catch all three together by surprise. The only place where all the conditions match perfectly is the firm where all three work. All the following days, Madison carefully avoided meeting her brothers, although they regularly came to visit the girl. The last thing she wanted to do was talk to them. Madison realized that her love for Richard was just an obsession. At first, she didn't like his advances. Then she dreamed of his future fame as a famous computer programmer. And then the girl felt sorry for the unrecognized genius, because he had worked so hard to write this super program. And when the truth came out that the program was a figment of Richard's dreams, she felt offended that she had been tricked for so long. As they say, everything is for the best, Madison thought. She spent all her free time at the hospital with Jonathan. At first, the attending physician seemed like a serious man who was only interested in medicine. In fact, Jonathan, as he asked to be called, was only 10 years older than her. His range of interests was so broad that Madison couldn't imagine how she could know so much. They spent days and evenings talking, and each time the subject was different. During this time, she learned a lot of new and useful information. And at the same time, Jonathan was not a connoisseur and did not try to be clever. Unlike her ex-fiancé, who at every opportunity let Madison know that she was stupid. The day of the discharge came. Madison couldn't hide her disappointment. This is it, she sighed sadly as she walked into her doctor's office. Why are you sighing so sadly? Jonathan smiled. I am being discharged today, and it's time to break up. Madison shrugged. You sound like you're going to another planet. Madison, why are you so sad? The man came up to the girl and put his arm around her. Are you saying that our relationship is over? Can't we continue it outside the hospital? Is that what you want? Madison asked hopefully. I do, Jonathan answered. As soon as I saw you, I knew we had to be together. You do? The girl's eyes lit up with happiness. Really, Jonathan kissed her cheek, which made Madison blush. She was pleased with the man's advances. There was one thing I didn't like. What's that? Madison frowned. Their relationship hadn't even begun yet, and already there were complaints. Madison, please deal with your brothers. I don't want them around you all the time. Plus, I'm confessing my love for you. Don't worry about that, she exhaled. I have an idea how to get them out. Which one do you think is lying? I don't know, Madison admitted honestly. What if Richard is telling the truth? And he hasn't cheated on you? Jonathan asked with concern in his voice. Would you go back to him? No, Madison answered. The situation had made it clear to me that I hadn't loved Richard for a long time. It was clear to me that I had treated him like a little child. Why? Jonathan wondered. I felt sorry for him, and I treated him like a piece of paper. He sat on my neck for so long and manipulated me. And I was stupid enough to let him do it because I felt sorry for him. How can it be that Richard works so hard and his program still doesn't appeal to his customers? As it turned out, it was his idea, and no one ever wanted his software. I see Jonathan pulled her tighter against him. What are your plans for today? I want to get all my stuff home first. Take a shower. Madison rested her head on Jonathan's shoulder. And then I want to go to that firm where all three of them work. Why? Why? She grinned. I want to catch them in an uncomfortable situation. That way I'll get them out in the open quicker. I won't let you go there alone. Jonathan was determined. I'm coming with you. I'm just finishing my workday for the day. Great. Madison kissed the man. You'll be a great support. I'm going to go pack. I'll be waiting for you downstairs in the car. Jonathan smiled at her. He was glad he had met her. He was glad that he had met her. It so happened that all the girls he had relationships with did not understand his attitude towards work. After all, Jonathan gave himself to it completely, and the girls were capricious, forcing him to choose between work and them. Jonathan had always chosen work, as it was the only thing he saw the meaning of his life in. It was only now, when Madison came along, that he realized what it was to love and be with this girl all the more. Madison understood him and accepted him for who he was, and now he would do anything to make this fragile girl happy. Walking out of the hospital into the street, Madison breathed a full sigh. How she had missed fresh air all this time. Madison, don't stay out in the cool air too long, or you'll catch a cold. Jonathan shouted. He was standing outside his car waiting for the girl. When he saw Madison, the man opened the car door for her. Please, my princess, the carriage is here, he said. Thank you, my king. Madison smiled back. She was pleased with Jonathan's advances, unlike Richard, who never even gave her a hand when she got off the bus. The gallant Jonathan's manners were on point. Where are we going? The man asked as he got into the car. Home first, Madison replied happily. I want to take a quick shower to wash off all the hospital odors. No hard feelings, okay? Even though I love my job so much, every time I come home from the hospital, I shower and wash my clothes too. I feel like I smell sick. Then go home now, Jonathan commanded. When they entered their flat, the girl's mood had dropped considerably. It was obvious that Richard had never moved out. She picked up her former young man's traveling bag and quickly threw Richard's things into it. Well, that's it, I guess, said a satisfied Madison as she walked around the flat and looked around. She didn't want any little thing to remind her of their former relationship. Jonathan, I'm going to take a shower. Could you put the kettle on? I'm dying for a sip of green tea. As you say, my princess, the man kissed the girl on the cheek and went to the kitchen. An hour later, the young people headed to the firm where the brothers worked. The girl just couldn't wait to look them both in the eyes, as well as to set things straight. When Madison and Jonathan entered the office where the brothers worked, they saw Oswald kissing Chris. What an interesting picture. Madison grinned. And you, girl, I see that you are not bad. You're having an affair with two brothers at once. Madison, what are you doing here? Oswald was confused. Then he looked at Jonathan, and he was instantly angry. And your protector is here. We've come to set things straight, Jonathan said, explaining his presence. Where's Richard? Madison asked. I don't think we can find out the truth without him. I'm here. Richard walked into the office. I was on a call. Madison, hi. You've been discharged? Yeah, today. Madison held out a bag of her ex-fiance's stuff. Here, this is yours. Did you decide to break up with me after all? Richard sighed sadly. Yes, I realize that you and I are too different, so you and I are no longer on the same path. That's a shame. You're a fool, brother. Oswald grinned wryly. If I were you, I wouldn't let Madison go. I'd fight for her. What's the point? Richard asked indifferently. Believe me, I know that look in Madison's eyes. She's not in love with me anymore. Wait, are you saying Madison is with that right now? Oswald pointed his head at Jonathan. Choose your words, young man, Jonathan warned in a cautionary tone. Or what? Oswald asked defiantly. All right, everybody calm down. Madison looked angrily at those present. Oswald, I want to thank you. For what? Stupefied young man. If it hadn't been for your adventure, I would never have met Jonathan. The girl's eyes lit up with happiness. I would have lived on hopes and promises of a better life. Madison, I can give you an even better one. Oswald began. But he was interrupted by Chris, who screamed hysterically. Honey, what's all this? The girl stomped her foot. First you swore to me in love, saying that you want to marry. And then you actually did? Jesus, Chris, look at yourself, Oswald grinned. I just needed you to come to Madison and introduce yourself as Richard's fiancée. That's all I needed. You used me? Chris squealed. Do you think it's possible to have a serious relationship with someone like you? Oswald grinned. You are only for fun and nothing more. Not like Madison. How is she better than me? Chris looked at her rival with dislike. Everything, Oswald replied. Look at you and her. It is because of women like Madison committed feats. Enough. Madison ordered. I'm not interested in your relations, came out the boss and turned to those present. Oswald, I never want you in my life again. If it weren't for your pregnancy, I would have succeeded, Oswald said angrily. The only thing that would have worked out for you is that Richard and I would have split up, Madison said firmly. But I would never have been with you, that's for sure. I hope that was the last time we see each other. That goes for the three of you. Shall we go? Jonathan asked. He put his arm around Madison's shoulders. Let's go, she smiled at her lover. Suddenly her gaze fell on Richard, who stood like a child abandoned by his mother. He lowered his head and did not know what he should do next. For a moment she felt sorry for her former fiancé, but the girl quickly pulled herself together. After all, Richard was a man who had to become independent. Madison and Jonathan left the office. The girl breathed a sigh of relief. God, I can breathe easy. Madison smiled. Then she kissed Jonathan on the cheek. Where are we going? Let's go to the park and walk, she suggested. That's a great idea. Madison took Jonathan's hand. She was happy to have met him. She saw in him all the qualities of a man she had always dreamed of. In the short time they had known each other, Jonathan had proved himself to be responsible, honest, and wise. He had become a friend to Madison, someone she could confide in. This man would not hesitate to lean on her shoulder in times of need, and he was the only one she was willing to share the family's troubles with. Overhearing the conversation between her son and daughter-in-law, Maria Petrovna was numb. She heard such a thing, she gathered. Albert, we can't go on like this. Linda exclaimed indignantly. How much longer are we going to be crammed into this tiny room? The baby's coming, and we don't even have a place to put the cot. What can I do? Albert didn't even turn round, still staring at the monitor. You know, we can't take out a mortgage, we need money for a down payment. And because of your whims, we can't save up any money. Let's move in with your parents. They have a bigger flat than this one, 2 rooms, but separate. And the kitchen is bigger. Linda. And your mummy will live here alone like a queen. Besides, you know my daddy's very sick. He needs peace and quiet. Besides, he and my mum live in separate rooms. And you're suggesting we put them in the same room? They'd fight all the time. Mummy likes to watch soap operas all day and Daddy hates them. No, I'm not going to let my parents be bullied. Yeah, Albert nodded. So you can bully my mum? He raised his voice. She already doesn't know where to get away from your eternal discontent. She only comes into the kitchen when you're not home. And she's the landlady, not you. So live with your mum, Linda cried. I'll go away. And when the baby is born, I'll raise it myself. And you won't even see it. Linda, calm down, Albert hugged his wife. You mustn't worry. I'll think of something. Just be patient. Amelia sat on the sofa in the next room and listened to the conversation between her son and daughter-in-law. What can you think of? She sighed heavily. Albert works all day long as it is. Even on Saturdays, he is not at home. His salary is small, he can't afford a flat. I can understand Linda too. She wants to be the boss of her own flat. And here I am, an old woman, disturbing them. She lay down on the sofa and closed her eyes, trying to sleep, but sleep did not come to her. But memories came back to her mind. Amelia had raised Albert alone, without a husband. As it happened, she was unattractive, tall, thin. And she didn't dress fashionably. What man would pay attention to such a thing? She came to the city from the country. She entered a school for painters and plasterers, lived in a dormitory. And after graduation, she got a job in a construction organization, from which she got a small room in a communal flat. She worked on weekends, went to the village, helped her mother to take care of the vegetable garden. Her mother called her back home, but Amelia refused. I don't want to go back to the village. There's nothing to do here, and it's not interesting, she said. You can't go back to your parents' house. Her mother chastised her. You should have looked for a bloke here. You'd get married, and then you'd have kids. But you live in your town like an old woman. You'll end up like an old maid. You're nearly 30 years old, and you've never even had a man, have you? Amelia resented her mother and promised she wouldn't visit her for a long time after such talk. But on Saturday, she took the bus back to her home village. She had no friends in the city, and those with whom she was friends were married, had children, and were busy with their own worries. The only thing left was to spend all her weekends in the village. And on Monday morning, the first bus back to the city. It was on this bus that she met Nicholas, who was returning from the wedding of an army friend. He helped her carry the heavy bag of potatoes and pickles her mother had packed to the house where she lived, and suggested that they meet the next day. Amelia was hesitant at first, but then agreed. She liked Nicholas for his courtesy and his easy, cheerful disposition. At work all day, she thought about what she would wear on her first date, and decided to wear a dark blue skirt and a white jumper. She didn't have anything else in her wardrobe. You look like you're dressed for a party meeting, Nicholas joked when he saw Amelia. All right, no offense. It was a joke. Well, why don't we not go to the cinema, but take a walk in the park? Amelia suggested. She was afraid to stay with Nicholas in the dark, even in the cinema, which was full of people. Well, in the park. So in the park, he took her by the hand. Can I buy you an ice cream? He asked. When he saw that the girl shook her head negatively, he shrugged again. They walked leisurely along the park alley and talked. Or rather, Nicholas spoke alone, and Amelia listened to him attentively and laughed at his jokes. Once a young lieutenant was sent to our unit, Nicholas said with a laugh. As soon as I saw him, I was stunned. It turned out to be Austin. He and I lived in the same house, even went to the same school. Only he was a few years younger. I was in my second year of service, soon to be discharged. So Nicholas lit a cigarette. I met a girl at that time, even you could say. We had an affair. All my leave was spent with her. And it was a young business. I wanted to see her more often. But you can't go, oh, Walla Patrol will stop you at once. Yes, they can put you in the brig, and then you won't be able to see her at all. So that's what I came up with. I started asking Austin for his lieutenant's uniform. Officers' uniforms didn't stop patrols in the city, so they could move around freely. Took me a long time to convince him that countrymen should help each other out, that sort of thing. And I did, because when Austin was on holiday, I'd put on his uniform and go out on the town. I did it once, I did it again. And the third time I came back to the unit, I ran into my own Oliver. How surprised he was to see me wearing my lieutenant's epaulets. I never went on leave again for the rest of my tour. What did they do to Austin? Did they punish him too? Amelia asked anxiously. No, Nicholas waved his hand. I didn't give him away. He said he'd borrowed the uniform, and from whom I do not know. From Nicholas's story, Amelia learned that he lived in a hostel and worked at the factory as a milling machine operator. He has never been married and has no plans to marry. It's too early for me to have a family, he said, and lit another cigarette. I look at my friends who have already got married. So it's a deadly bore. And if you get a bad wife, it's a disaster. My mate Ashley, he's rushing home after work. I say to him, Ashley, let's have a beer. Take the edge off, and he tells me that if his wife smells alcohol, she'll make a scene, and from his body for a week. And what about the children? Amelia wondered. Don't you want to be a father already? Children? Nicholas grinned. I never wanted to have them. It's a lot of trouble. First you have to get up at night, then take them to daycare, then do homework with them, and how much money is spent on them. And in the end, you don't know what your son or daughter will grow up to be. Our foreman Michael's son went downhill. Got mixed up with a bad crowd. Almost ended up in juvie. What's he got to look forward to? Father's a respectable man, mother's a librarian, and the kid grows up to be a thug. Maybe he lacked parental attention. Amelia suggested. The son has shoes, clothes. What kind of attention is needed? Nicholas objected. Nobody took care of me when I was a kid either. My father died early. My mother worked 2 jobs to feed me and my sister. And nothing. I grew up a decent man. I work, and I send money to my mother. Amelia didn't answer, though she disagreed with Nicholas about family and children. Perhaps he doesn't realize yet that children are a great happiness, she thought. How can one not love them? They walked round the park some more, and Nicholas walked Amelia home. He didn't ask her out again, and Amelia decided that she didn't like Nicholas, and he didn't want to continue hanging out with her anymore. She was surprised to see Nicholas sitting on a bench outside her driveway a few days later on her way home from work. Oh, Amelia was embarrassed, adjusting the dress she'd been wearing that day. I didn't even expect to see you again. Maybe we should go for a walk, Nicholas suggested, getting up from the bench. The weather's so nice. Amelia nodded her head in agreement, and they walked towards the small square. She was very embarrassed by her appearance, but Nicholas didn't seem to mind. He was joking again, talking ironically about his friends, and not asking Amelia about anything. Yes, she had nothing to tell about herself. She lived in the village, studied, now she works. That's all. Would anyone be interested in that? At the entrance, Nicholas suggested that Amelia meet at the weekend and still go to the cinema for an interesting film that had recently been released. Once again, Amelia agreed. She was very pleased that a guy like Nicholas was paying attention to her. So they started dating. And 2 months later, Nicholas stayed in her room for a sleepover. Amelia did not want to invite him to the flat, but he was persistent, saying that he would only have a cup of tea and go to his dormitory. How they ended up in the same bed, Amelia didn't exactly realize. Nicholas's kisses were so sweet that she felt as if she had lost her head. "So I'm your first man?" Nicholas asked in surprise. "I didn't expect it. Why didn't you tell me right away? I would have been more gentle with you." Amelia didn't say anything. She was ashamed. She sat on the bed with her legs tucked under her and the blanket covering her. "Why are you so scared, you silly girl?" Nicholas tried to touch Amelia, but she recoiled. "You should have had your baby a long time ago. And you've been walking around?" He swore foully. "Well, I'm going to go. It's getting late. They might not let me into the dormitory. We're strict about that." After seeing Nicholas off, Amelia went back to her room and couldn't sleep until morning, remembering what had happened between them. "I don't even know what he'll think of me now," Amelia worried. "And he'll refuse to date me since I'm so easily available." But Nicholas began to visit her 2 or 3 times a week. Sometimes they went to the cinema, but more often Amelia fed him dinner, and then they went to bed, and Nicholas stayed with her all night. "I wish I could marry him," Amelia looked fondly at the sleeping Nicholas. "Why, he's a hard-working bloke, and the fact that he drinks a lot of beer is no big deal. That's why he's a man. And who doesn't drink nowadays?" Amelia closed her eyes and imagined herself in a white wedding dress and long veil. As she and Nicholas walked out of the registry office, he picks her up in his arms and twirls her round and round, and Amelia laughed happily. She rarely visited her mother in the village. "No time. We have a lot of work," Amelia justified. "I've gone to work at the factory. I'll become an apprentice." "True, my room had to be returned, and I had to move to a dormitory. But they say that they give flats to the front runners of production. So I'm trying my best. I want so much to have a separate place where I would be a mistress." "It's time for you to get married. That's what my mother said admonishingly. You are getting on in years. Are you going to stay a maiden?" "I will not." Amelia lowered her eyes. She hadn't told her mother about Nicholas yet, although they had been dating for a year. When they moved into the dormitory, they didn't see each other as often as before. Only when her roommate Jessie worked a different shift or went to her family for the weekend, Nicholas would come to Amelia's house and stay until the morning. But lately he'd been coming less and less often. Amelia waited for him, heating dinner, and then cried into her pillow. One day on her day off, Amelia had breakfast with her roommate Jessie. She had cooked a delicious scrambled egg and was now happily eating it, helping with a slice of bread. Amelia had barely brought her fork to her mouth when she felt dizzy and barely made it to the toilet. "What's the matter with you?" Jessie asked in surprise. "Are you pregnant?" "I'm not." Amelia smiled strangely. "I must have been poisoned yesterday. I bought a pie on the street. I thought it looked suspicious." "Yeah," Jessie grinned. "My mom's been pregnant 5 times and she used to say the same thing. For milk, for pies. You should go to a woman's doctor and get yourself checked out. Don't tell me you've never been with a bloke. I found cigarette butts in my room more than once. So you brought him here while I was away." Amelia blushed up to her ears and skewed her lower lip. "You think it was me? There's no way anyone could have come into the room." Go to the clinic." Jessie continued to insist. "It won't be too late. You can have an abortion before it's too late. What are you going to do with a child now? No flat, no mother to help you." "All right." Amelia nodded her head. "To calm you down, I'll go to the doctor, then we'll laugh together." But there was no laughing. Amelia was indeed pregnant. She came out of the antenatal clinic and didn't know what to do next. Sitting down on a bench, Amelia thought, "We should tell Nicholas everything. As it happens, he has to marry me now. He's not going to give up his own child." She cheered up, got up from the bench, and went home. Waiting until the weekend, when Jeezy was away at her parents' house, Amelia waited for Nicholas to tell him that he was going to be a father. Nicholas was late that day and didn't arrive until the evening drunk. A friend had a son, he told Amelia from the doorstep, so we had a little celebration. He came into the room and sat down on a chair. He already had 2 daughters, but Scott just wanted a son. A son is a son. Nicholas held up his index finger. An heir. What would you do if you knew you were going to have a son soon? Amelia asked cautiously. Nicholas hesitated. The devil knows. He put his foot on his leg. Never thought about it. And if you think about it? Amelia looked at him slyly. Well, I suppose I'd be glad, Nicholas said uncertainly. Why do you ask such questions? Well, then rejoice. Amelia clapped her hands. I'm pregnant, and I'm sure that we'll have a boy. Stop. Nicholas wiped his face with the palm of his hand. Who's having a boy? Me and you. Amelia's joy faded a little. We do. I've already been to the doctor, who confirmed that I'm going to be a mum and you're going to be a dad. Isn't that great? Now you and I can get married and get our own flat as soon as possible. Married? Nicholas was startled. Why? What do you mean? Amelia was upset. We need our child to have a mom and a dad. Or do you mind? Her eyes filled with tears. I don't mind in principle. Nicholas got up from his chair and started walking toward the door. I'm going to go. I need to think it over. I'll come back tomorrow and we'll talk about it. Okay, Amelia agreed nonchalantly. Tomorrow is tomorrow, but come before lunchtime, because Jay-Z might be back early. But neither tomorrow, nor the day after tomorrow, nor a week later, Nicholas did not come. Desperate, Amelia went to the neighboring factory to look for Nicholas and find out what had happened to him. But she was shocked by the news that Nicholas Morris had been paid and had gone somewhere. Not even his closest mates knew where. Amelia couldn't believe that Nicholas had abandoned her, too. Not just her, but their unborn child. What am I going to do now? She sobbed as she sank into her pillow. What? Jesse grinned. You need an abortion. It's no big deal. You're not the first, you're not the last. I'm not going to kill my baby. Amelia covered her still flat belly with her hands. I'll raise it myself alone, and we don't need no daddy. She buried her head in the pillow again and cried even louder. Yes, it's a mess, sighed Jay-Z. What are you going to tell your mother? I thought you said she was strict. Aha, Amelia exclaimed. I'll have to tell her. She wouldn't kill her own daughter. Besides, she'd just been dreaming of grandchildren. The next weekend, Amelia went to the village. Mrs. Anna shook her head. I haven't heard a word from you for 2 months. Come on, get dressed and go to the garden. You can help dig potatoes. Amelia dug potatoes, but refused to take the buckets full of them into the cellar. What's the matter? Mrs. Anna was angry. The town has spoiled you so much that you can't help your mother. I shouldn't be lifting weights right now. Amelia lowered her eyes. The doctor said not to. Is something wrong? Are you ill? Mrs. Anna looked at her daughter anxiously. What did the doctor say? Mom, I'm pregnant. Amelia, after a moment's silence, blurted out at the top of her lungs and backed away, afraid her mother would hit her with a spade. "Yes," said Mrs. Anna. "It's a long way off. If there's a hole, there'll be a hole. Who's the father? Do you know him well?" Amelia dodged the question. "Well, we met." Mrs. Anna rubbed her lower back. "Come next weekend. I'll heat the sauna, set the table. Come on. The future son-in-law can butter me up. He can bring me a glass of water in my old age." "It's only my child." Amelia lowered her head. "I will bring him up alone." Said Mrs. Anna. "I've lost my maiden honor and forgotten it. Have you thought how I'll look in people's eyes? They'll say Amelia Robinson's a girl in an interesting position. What a shame." Mrs. Anna was indignant. "What do you think I should do?" "Do what?" Amelia took a couple of steps back again. "Give birth, of course. I'm not getting rid of the baby, and I don't care if they point the finger at me." "What can I do with you now?" Mrs. Anna sighed. "The girl's not old enough. Maybe a child will brighten your loneliness." In the evening, they sat at the table for a long time, discussing how to live their lives and what would be best for the unborn baby. They decided that Amelia would stay in town so that there would be no cause for rumors in the village. And it was better to give birth there. The doctors were close by. She'll also go to the trade union and push for a separate flat. Like a single mom. Mrs. Anna will sell all the animals, close the house, and move in with her daughter to help with the baby. Amelia will go to work because she has to earn money. There's no one else to help. And Mrs. Ann will look after her grandson and run the household. Just a month before the birth, Amelia moved into a small one-room flat, and soon Mrs. Anna arrived from the village. At the due date, Amelia gave birth to a son, whom she named Albert. When in the maternity hospital she was brought her son for the first time and pressed him to her breast, she immediately realized that this boy was the meaning of her life. 3 months later, Amelia went to work. For some reason, she had no milk, and the pediatrician advised her to switch the boy to formula feeding. Because of this, Amelia was very worried about not being able to feed her son herself. She wanted to give her child the best, so she did not refuse any overtime, sometimes working 2 shifts in a row at the machine. The foreman turned a blind eye to this. For him, the main thing was to fulfill the plan. Mrs. Anna finally settled in the city. Only she wouldn't sell her house in the village. When Albert grows up, she said, "We'll go to the village for the whole summer." Let the boy Albert breathe fresh air. 2 years later, the factory gave Amelia a small 2-room flat with a pass-through room and a small kitchen. But Amelia and her mother were happy about it. "Albert will go to school, and he'll have his own room," Mrs. Anna said proudly. "And you and me, my daughter, will share a room. And if you have to get married, I won't get in your way. I'll go back to the village." No, Amelia shook her head. "I'm not going to get married. What if a father who isn't my own starts hurting my little boy? And what do I need a husband for? It's only trouble." After a while, Mrs. Anna suddenly began to complain of pain in her heart, although she had no problems with it before. And her blood pressure was constantly rising, and no medication helped. Doctors helplessly waved their hands and advised to change the climate for a while. After consulting Amelia, Mrs. Anna decided to go to her village for a couple of months to live in peace and quiet, not in the hustle and bustle of the city. Albert was already in kindergarten, and Amelia had to transfer to another shop to work only the day shift. In the village, Mrs. Anna came alive, even managed to make a few beds. In the vegetable garden, carrots and turnips, vitamins for Albert, she said. One morning, a neighbor came to her house, brought a can of steamed milk, and saw Mrs. Anna lying on the floor. The neighbor started calling for help, but it was too late. Mrs. Anna had been dead for a couple of hours. Amelia took a long time to get over her mother's death and blamed herself for letting the sick woman go alone to the village. But life went on. In addition, Albert demanded attention, and Amelia's heartache at losing her mother began to subside a little. Soon she sold her parents' house in the village. With this money, she made some repairs in the flat and renewed the furniture in the room of her son, who was soon to go to the first grade. Again, Amelia worked hard. In addition to her main job at the factory, in the evening she washed the entrances to the house. She needed money, which she spent without regret on her son Albert. He had everything he wanted: an expensive football, toys, table hockey. Amelia tried to make sure that the boy, who was growing up without a father, did not need anything. When returning from work, Amelia always went to the shop and bought Albert sweets. She bought fruit for him exclusively at the market, as well as cottage cheese, meat, and fish. There were times when wages were delayed at the factory and there was only money left in her purse for traveling. Even then, Amelia managed to feed her son something tasty, inventing her own recipes and using what she could find in the fridge. She herself might not eat it all these days, or she would wait for what Albert left on his plate. The most important thing for her was that her son never went hungry. She looked at her son fondly when he ate, and she didn't even worry that she would be left without lunch at work tomorrow. She did her best: malnutrition, lack of sleep. She was very tired, working 2 and sometimes 3 jobs. But she never complained, because she did it all for the sake of her favorite son Albert. Albert himself did not cause his mother much trouble. He studied well at school, played sports, and attended an aeromodeling club. Amelia was proud of her son and blushed with embarrassment when he was praised at parents' meetings for participating in sports events or helping to clean up the school grounds. When he was in high school, Albert began to work part-time himself, cleaning entrances to help his mother. He was shy, but he never refused to unload goods in a shop or help someone carry heavy things. He always used the proceeds to buy his mother her favorite Palanca sponge cake, or they would go to an ice cream parlor together and Albert would pay for it himself, proudly taking the money out of his pocket. Amelia was happy to have such an attentive and caring son, telling everyone she knew about him. After graduating from high school, Albert enrolled at the Polytechnic University. He wanted to apply to a construction technical school, but his mother Amelia insisted that he must have a higher education, which no one in their family had ever had. After classes, Albert worked part-time again, either as a loader in a warehouse or as a waiter in a cafe. Amelia now did not clean the entrances, and at the factory she moved to the receiving department, because after a long time working at the machine, her legs were very sore. All in all, they were doing well. The only thing that upset Amelia was that Albert would not introduce her to any girl and did not want to marry her. And Amelia wanted to have grandchildren. "Mum, why should I get married?" he said, laughing. "I'm fine as I am. Who else will take care of me like you? And I have nothing to offer a girl: my own flat, no car too. And I don't make much money yet. Not many people would go for that. But you're handsome and clever." Amelia looked at her son with love. "The rest is a matter of time. What do you need a flat for? You can live here. There's plenty of room for everyone. And when I die, you'll be the masters of the whole place." "No, Mum, I don't want to." Albert shook his head. "You and I are good together." After the institute, Albert got a job. From time to time, he met one girl or the other, but he did not start any serious relationships. Everything changed when he met Linda, a tall, blue-eyed beauty with long blonde hair. They met at a birthday party at a mutual friend's house and left together. Albert walked the girl to her house, agreeing that they would see each other again in a few days. Linda was 4 years younger than Albert, had also graduated from university and worked as a marketer in a trading company. She talked interestingly about the countries she had traveled to and her work. Linda was so light and cheerful that she literally turned Albert's head. They had already been dating for 6 months, when Albert decided to introduce Linda to his mother. "Mum, I finally met the girl of my dreams and I want you to meet her," he announced one evening. Oh, son, I'm so glad. Amelia splashed her hands. We must set the table. I'll bake pies with cabbage and potatoes as you like. What is your girlfriend like? Linda doesn't eat anything sweet or flowery, Albert grinned. She's on a diet to keep her figure. So don't cook anything. We'll just have tea. I'll buy a low-fat cake myself. It's not very human, Amelia shrugged. A new person comes into the house, and we can't even give them a proper meal. Don't worry, Mum. Albert put his arm round Amelia's shoulders. The main thing for me is that you like each other. I'll like any girl you like, son. Amelia stroked her son's head. The main thing is that she loves you, and you love her too. I want you to be happy. But no matter what Amelia said, she didn't like Linda. She's a tricky one, she said to herself as Albert left to walk Linda home. She smiles sweetly, but her eyes are evil. Oh, this new fashion. A slice of cake and a cup of tea, that's all the treat. But it was evident that Albert loved her, and that was important. I'll get used to her somehow, Amelia decided. My grandmother used to say a hen pecking at a grain. She keeps the whole yard in her memory. Mum, what do you think of Linda? Albert asked excitedly when he got home. Isn't she beautiful? She's beautiful, Amelia agreed, nodding her head. But she's very thin. What keeps her soul alive? Do you love her? Very much. Albert averted his eyes in embarrassment. And I want her to be my wife. Now it's time for you to marry, Amelia smiled. Well, son, so be it. They decided to have the wedding in 3 months, so that they would have time to prepare for it. Albert told Linda at once that they would live with his mom. You see, Linda, he said, we have no extra money for rented accommodation. We'll have to spend a lot of money on the wedding. And I've already bought the honeymoon vouchers. In the meantime, we'll live with my mom in a separate room, save money for the down payment, and take a mortgage on the flat. My mom's very nice. I think you'll get along with her. Of course, my love, Linda replied gently. You're absolutely right. Why pay money to strangers when you have somewhere to live? We'll be patient for a while, but then we'll move into a bigger and more spacious flat. Linda answered in a way that made Albert like her even more. She had not thought about a future life with her mother-in-law. She knew the saying, patience and hard work will get you through it. The wedding was celebrated in a restaurant. The bride's parents insisted on it. Amelia was uncomfortable. She had never been to such a place. Every now and then she was adjusting the new dress she had bought for the celebration. And when she sat down at the table, she took off her shoes with a small heel, which stung, but were very beautiful and matched the dress. Through tears, she looked at her grown son in his dark blue suit and white flower in his buttonhole. She was proud that she alone had managed to raise such a handsome boy, who might soon become a father himself. And she, Amelia, would have long awaited grandchildren. Linda was also very pretty. In a snow-white long dress, she looked like a porcelain statue. The guests kept shouting. Bitter, the bride and groom rose from their seats and kissed embarrassedly. And I've never had a wedding. And I've never worn a white dress either, Amelia suddenly thought. But she immediately dismissed the thought. What's there to be jealous of? She was angry with herself. You should be happy. My only son is getting married. My pride and support in my old age. The bride's parents said that the wedding should be celebrated in half. We realize, of course, that you're on a tight budget, Miranda said when they met Amelia before the wedding. We're not rich either, but we do value our only children, so we don't have to make a mess of it in front of the guests. Amelia didn't know what rich people were and tried to object. We don't have many guests on our side. No relatives. Albert will invite a few of his mates from school and work. That's all. It doesn't matter, Miranda said. Just be thankful we're not making you buy the bride's outfit. Like we used to? Believe me, it's not cheap. Laura picked out a dress at the salon for her. She named the cost of the dress, a price that made Amelia gasp. Well, Miranda continued, we're not going to skimp on our own daughter. A wedding is a once-in-a-lifetime event. Well, maybe 2, she thought. 3 at the most. So we need the bride to be the most beautiful. Amelia withdrew all the money from her book, which wasn't much. She borrowed the rest from acquaintances, which she paid back for a year, limiting herself in many things. She had no money for a present for the young people. She remembered that her mother had given her gold earrings with red stones, so she decided to give them to her daughter-in-law. Linda fiddled with the earrings. She wrinkled her nose, but thanked her mother-in-law and gave the earrings to her mother, who immediately hid them in her purse. Immediately after the wedding, Albert and Linda left for their honeymoon, and Amelia began to organize their room. She washed the window, changed the curtains, and made the bed with new linen. She put a small rug on the floor. Good, she sighed with satisfaction as she looked into the room. When Linda and Albert get back, we'll be a family. Fie, what are those curtains? Linda was outraged when she entered the room. It's like the country. Well, of course they are. Amelia was confused. I bought them a long time ago, but I kept saving them, regretting such a beauty. So the curtains had to come in handy. The room became cozier at once. What's this? Linda saw a rug on the floor. It's very rustic. Do you want to make our room into a rustic hut for Albert and me? Mum, really? Albert supported her. We'll sort it out ourselves. Do as you please. Amelia took offense and left the room. From the open door, she could hear Linda's continued outrage and Albert's affectionate reassurance. In the kitchen, Linda also immediately put her own order. The bottom shelf in the fridge is yours. Put your food there, and we'll put it on the middle and top shelves. We'll eat separately because I'm on a diet. I'm cooking everything low-fat. It's time for Albert to start thinking about his health. Linda brought some nice crockery from her parents, pots and pans, a small frying pan. There was only room for Amelia in one narrow cupboard, 2 pots, a couple of plates, a cup and a few other kitchen utensils. Linda packed everything else into a large bag and took it to the rubbish bin. Why do you keep all this stuff? She was indignant again. Gold-rimmed mugs, 3 plates, bent spoons. Who needs it? My mother brought it from the village, she answered timidly. How could I get rid of it? There are so many beautiful sets for sale. Linda sighed. And you can't get rid of a rustic. Linda continued to tidy up the flat, which had been literally transformed. In her and Albert's room, there was a new sofa and a small wardrobe. There were blinds on the windows and a plasma TV on the wall opposite the sofa. In the bathroom, Albert had installed shelves on which stood jars of creams, shampoo, and other feminine products that Amelia didn't understand. Son, she asked Albert when Linda wasn't home, did you get a bonus or something? If you bought such a marvelous thing, she pointed to the automatic washing machine. It must be expensive. Mum, Albert laughed. Now you can buy everything on credit. What do you mean? Amelia looked at her son in bewilderment. It's like this: first you buy a thing, and then you pay for it gradually, Albert explained. Everybody lives like that nowadays, and you don't have to save up for years to buy something you need. I'm planning to buy a car that way too, and I'm paying off the TV here, and then I'll take out a new loan. Unless Linda needs a fur coat, he laughed. When do you plan to have children? Amelia asked Albert. Later, Albert said. We want to live for ourselves first, to see the world. And it will be difficult to do that with children. We'll have to spend a lot of money on nappies and nappy covers. Sometimes Linda's friends came to visit. They'd sit in the kitchen for long periods of time, smoking. It gave Amelia a headache and she couldn't sleep all night. But she didn't say anything to her son or daughter-in-law. What are the young ones to do? Old age will come, and you won't want to socialize with anyone. Twice a year, Linda and Albert went on holiday. And then Amelia felt like a full-fledged mistress in the flat. She could sit at the table in the kitchen for long periods of time, watch television, cook leisurely, standing at the cooker. And most importantly, she enjoyed the silence. No one walked back and forth across her room, and she could sleep well at night. When Amelia retired a few years later, it became even more difficult to live in the flat. Linda wasn't working by then either. She had quit her old job and was looking for a new one. But she was in no hurry to get a new job. But she was always reproaching Albert for not earning enough money. Linda slept until lunchtime, during which time Amelia had time to eat breakfast and prepare her own food so that she would not disturb her daughter-in-law in the kitchen. Linda liked to sit at the table for a long time with one foot on the chair, take her time drinking coffee, smoking 1 or 2 cigarettes, and looking out of the window somewhere in the distance. Amelia tried to get out of the house by this time, whatever the weather. Amelia would walk down the street, going into shops to keep warm or to hide from the rain. She would return towards evening when Albert came home from work. She felt more at ease with him. Late at night, when they went to their room and switched on the television, Amelia couldn't sleep well, waking up to any noise, Albert going to the toilet, Linda needing to get a glass of water from the kitchen. When Amelia found out that Linda was pregnant, she was overjoyed. Finally, after 5 years, she would have a grandson or granddaughter. She began to imagine walking down the avenue with a pram, looking at the sleeping baby. But what she heard shattered all her dreams. So I'm not wanted here, she got up from the sofa and walked to the window, where it was already dark. Well, she sighed heavily, they have their own family, and I'll live somehow. How much of that life is left? In the morning, when Albert had gone to work, Amelia took out a checkered notebook from her bedside table, tore out a piece of paper and began to write something. She didn't go out for a walk as usual that day, and didn't mind that an irritated Linda was pacing around the flat and even dropped a stool in the kitchen a few times, kicking it with her foot. In the evening, when Albert came home, Amelia came into the kitchen and sat down across from him. "Son, I need to talk to you," she said. "What's wrong, Mum?" Albert looked at her anxiously. "Is it something serious?" "You see, son, it's like this." Amelia was silent for a while. "I have to go away, probably for a long time." "Why?" Where to? Albert wondered. "I got a letter from Aunt Gwen today." Amelia took a small piece of paper out of her pocket and showed it to Albert, but did not hand it to him. "Well, do you remember Aunt Gwen, your grandmother's cousin?" "How would you remember her? When we went to the village, you were very young." "Aunt Gwen says she's ill and needs help," Amelia said quickly, so that her son wouldn't understand. "She has no family left and no one to look after her. So Aunt Gwen asked me to look after her, and in return she'll give me the deed to her house. It's a good house. It'll last 100 years. Then you can sell it, add some money, and buy you a flat." Albert stretched out. "Well, if you have to, go. But let's leave at the weekend so I can walk you to the bus." No, Amelia waved her hands fearfully. "I'll go tomorrow. Aunt Gwen writes to tell me to leave right away. I don't know how long the letter has been traveling. It might be too late. Don't worry. I haven't got much. Why don't Linda at least come with you?" Albert offered tentatively. "What's the matter, son?" She waved her hand again. "Linda is in such a state now that she needs to take care of herself. Don't worry, I'll get there myself." "How's that?" You know, Albert got up from the table. "Will you be back in time for the birth of our child?" I don't know. Amelia shook her head. I'm not going to guess. I don't know how things will turn out. Maybe I'll live there and stay there for good. So you can use the flat as you see fit, move into the big room. And you can make a nursery in the small one. Well, it's up to you. We'll figure it out. Albert left the kitchen and went into the room, where Linda's joyful voice could be heard. Amelia tore up the letter she had written to herself that morning and threw it in the rubbish bin. Then she went back to her room, opened the wardrobe and started pulling out her things, putting them into a small traveling bag. Almost 3 years had passed. Albert and Linda's family life was not going well. She reproached her husband for not devoting time to her or their little daughter. Albert replied that he worked 2 jobs so that the family did not need anything, because Linda's needs were growing more and more every day. And it was taking a lot of money for the baby. Over time, Albert realized that he probably didn't really love Linda, but was just fascinated by her beauty and attractiveness. And now it was as if a veil had fallen from his eyes. Linda turned out to be a very scandalous wife. She wanted Albert to help her around the house and earn a lot. He did not refuse to help his wife, coming back from work, bringing groceries. On rare weekends, he cleaned the flat and cooked meals. But he resented the fact that Linda sat all day on the phone, texting with girlfriends or ordering some things through an online shop. She did not do much with her daughter, who fortunately grew up a very quiet child and could play with toys on her own, without causing her mother much trouble. In addition, Albert was very offended at his wife for naming the newborn girl Angelina without consulting him. What kind of name is that? Albert was outraged at the time. I thought we were going to name our daughter Iris or Joyce or maybe Laura. Phew, Linda replied, embarrassed. Iris, Joyce. It's like the countryside, but Angelina. It's trendy and modern. Linda was supported by her mother-in-law, and Albert waved his hand. Call it what you like. Only his father-in-law sided with him. They'll call the girl Oliver Laughed, like a cow in an advert. The family was always short of money. Instead of saving a little, Linda ordered cosmetics and clothes she hardly ever wore. The wardrobe was full of her stuff. Those cosmetics were still in her nightstand drawer. Stop wasting money. Albert once told his wife, "We'll never save for our own flat." Why do we need a flat? Linda wondered. We're doing fine here for now. When Angelina grows up a little more, we'll exchange this flat for a bigger place. What do you mean? Albert looked at her in confusion. Actually, my mom is also registered here. She's gone to the country for a while. She can come back at any moment. This is already our flat. Linda looked at her husband angrily. Look, she circled the room with her hand. Where are we going to put your mom? And anyway, if she hasn't come here for so many years, she won't come back now. Albert thought about it. He hadn't heard from his mom in 3 years. He had never even visited her in the village. He decided that he would have to go there next weekend to see how she was doing. Maybe she needs some help. But soon Albert forgot about his promise. He got busy at work and had another fight with Linda. Or rather, they fought every night now. He hardly got home, and his mother-in-law was adding fuel to the fire. Other husbands to their wives and buy fur coats. And take to resorts, she said with a complaint son-in-law. And you in life, even a gold ring, cannot give a gift, which she has long dreamed of. So let her find a husband who will provide her with everything. Albert snapped back. Since I'm so bad. And she will nod at the mother-in-law. A beautiful girl like my daughter will never be left alone. She deserves the best. So let her go to the best. Albert couldn't stand it one day when his mother-in-law again reproached him for not earning enough money. I won't cry. Might as well pack my things now and get out of here. That's right. The mother-in-law proudly raised her head and turned to her daughter. "Linda, get ready. We're not staying in this flat with this worthless man for another minute." Linda defiantly started to take things out of the wardrobe and put them into a large bag. Albert watched silently. "We'll take the baby with us," too. The mother-in-law began to stuff toys into the bag. "My dear Angelina, your father is worthless. If he can't provide not only for his wife but also for his child." "Take it," Albert shrugged indifferently. "Nobody will forbid me to see my daughter anyway." "We'll see about that." The mother-in-law grabbed her granddaughter by the hand and pulled her into the hallway. Linda followed them, dragging her bag. "Don't forget to leave the keys to the flat," Albert reminded her. "Choke on it." Linda took the keys out of her purse and threw them at her husband. "You'll be sorry, but it'll be too late." "Yeah," Albert nodded and slammed the door behind them. Linda cried in the taxi. "Mum, maybe I shouldn't have left Albert." "No way," said her mother firmly. "Let him suffer. You'll see he'll come to you on his knees and beg for forgiveness. But don't be a fool and forgive him at once. Let him buy you a ring and a mink fur coat, which you have long dreamed of." "That's true." Linda wiped her tears. "Let him suffer, and I'll think about whether to forgive him or not." Sweet Angelina sat between her grandmother and mother and didn't understand what was happening. She was very sad that they had left her daddy, whom she loved very much. Albert did not show up at her mother-in-law's and father-in-law's flat the next day or a week later. There was also no call from him on his wife's phone. "Should I call him myself?" Linda asked her mom anxiously. "Don't you dare." Miranda looked at her daughter angrily. "He'll think you're humiliating yourself in front of him, and he'll stop appreciating you. Let's wait a little longer." Albert, meanwhile, felt almost happy. He missed his daughter, but at the same time he enjoyed his bachelor life. He was happy to come home after work, where no one reproached him or made scandals. Albert also realized that he missed his mother, her gentle voice, her care, her hard and yet soft hands. He lay awake all night remembering how he and his mother had gone to a cafe to eat ice cream, and how they had ridden on a merry-go-round in the park, and his mother had clutched her son's hand tightly out of fear. He remembered her fragrant pancakes, delicious pancakes, his favorite potato pies. The next day Albert took a day off work and went to the railway station. When he reached the village, he got out and looked around confused. He didn't know where to go next. He couldn't remember the house where Aunt Gwen and now Mum lived. So he decided to ask the first person he saw for directions. "Excuse me, please," he said to the postman, who was just delivering his pension. "I need to find a house. Only I don't know the landlady's surname. Her name is Gwen, and my mum Amelia lives with her now. You must know her. You probably bring her a pension too, don't you?" "I don't remember her," grumbled the postman. "There used to be a Mrs. Anna Robinson. She went to the city to see her daughter, and then she came back here and died. Her house has long since been sold." "So that's my grandmother." Albert rejoiced. She had a cousin, Aunt Gwen, whom my mother came to look after. "Oh, I remember." The postman nodded. "You must be talking about Gwen Hopkins." Albert nodded uncertainly. "She's been dead about 7 years since she was buried." "Who did my mum go to then?" Albert looked at the woman, perplexed. "I don't know, my dear, I don't know." The postman shrugged his shoulders and threw his bag from one shoulder to the other. "I've never seen her. Gwen's house is over there." She pointed to the end of the street, behind the green fence. "You'll recognize it." Albert followed the direction and soon found himself standing next to a ramshackle house with a hole in the roof and a rotten porch. "Mum," he covered his face with his hands. "Where am I going to find you now?" He remembered that when his mother had read him the letter, supposedly from Aunt Gwen. Her hands had trembled and she had tried not to look at her son, hiding the tears in her eyes. And she had taken very few things with her, and Linda had thrown the rest in the rubbish bin. How could I not have realized that Mom just didn't want to disturb us? Albert slapped his hand on his forehead. She'd spent her whole life trying to make me feel good, and I, the fool, hadn't appreciated it. Back in town, Albert thought about how he could find his mother. The first thing he did was to go to the police and file a missing persons report. They advised him to go to a home for the elderly. Could Amelia be there? So Albert, without delay, went straight to the address. The home for the elderly called Hope was not far from the city. "Can you tell me," he said to the pretty woman in uniform who was sitting at the desk, going through some papers, "is Amelia Robinson in your care?" "Robinson," the woman said thoughtfully. "Let me see." She began flipping through the lists of residents and shook her head in the negative. "No, we don't have her listed. Who does she look like to you?" "That's my mum." Albert lowered his head. "She lied to me when she said she had gone to the village to look after her aunt. I went to the village yesterday. Mum didn't even show up there. Now I don't know where to find her. I had hoped she lived here." He sighed heavily. "Alas, my hopes were not fulfilled. So I'll keep looking until I find her." "Why did she deceive you?" The woman looked at Albert with interest. "What did you do?" "I turned out to be a soulless son." He inclined his head even lower. "And now I want to make up for that mistake. Oh, if you knew how many old people live in our house who have been abandoned by their children." The woman sighed. "Everyone has a story to tell. Take Mrs. Anna Smith, who was brought to us after being picked up off the street. She'd been wandering round the town for days, sleeping at the railway station. The old woman said she'd lost her memory. She just called herself Anna, but she could not remember her surname or address where she lived, no matter how they questioned her. She didn't have any ID on her. We'd already given her the name Smith, as well as another name. When she was registered with us, we couldn't even find her relatives," the woman continued. "We don't know her real name or date of birth. She doesn't even receive a pension. We collected clothes for her, as they say, with the whole world, because she came to us with one small purse, which contained almost nothing, not even documents. When she had a bad cold, she repeated only the name Albert in her delirium. We thought it was her son, who must have kicked his mother out of the house when she lost her memory." Albert suddenly remembered that he had found his mum's passport when he was sorting out his papers. So she didn't take it or forgot to put it in her bag. And the name Anna made me suspicious. That was my grandmother's name. "Is this old woman alive?" he asked cautiously. "Can I see her?" Well, the woman rose from her seat. "Come on, I'll show her to you." Albert recognized the old woman sitting on the bed as his mother, who had aged and lost even more weight. "Mum," he called softly. Amelia flinched and turned round. "Albert, my son," she exclaimed, unable to believe her eyes. Mummy, I'm sorry." Albert fell on his knees in front of her and cried. "I am so guilty before you." "Calm down, my darling." Amelia stroked his head with her wrinkled hand. "I knew I would see you again. I believed you'd find me." "Mum, come on, let's go home." "You're not staying here anymore?" "Home?" Amelia looked at her son confused. "But I'll be in the way of everything. I'd rather stay here and you can visit me often." "You won't bother anyone," Albert assured her. "I live alone. I'm preparing for a divorce. I don't want such a wife. We'll live with you again, just the two of us. And sometimes Angelina will come to visit us." "Is that your new fiancé?" Amelia looked angrily at her son. "Angelina is my daughter," he laughed. "And your granddaughter, whom you must meet?" Albert asked. "I have a granddaughter?" Amelia was now crying with happiness. Yes, yes, Albert, you do. Amelia fussed. I'll pack quickly and we'll go home. I don't have much stuff, but I have enough. Thank you to the kind people who gave me everything I need. And thank them for not leaving me to die in the street. When Amelia entered her room, she stopped on the threshold, hesitating to go any further. Mum, what are you doing? Albert was surprised. Come in, come in. You're the rightful owner of this place now. I didn't think I'd ever come back here again, she said, looking round. Maybe I should go back to the old people's home. Amelia looked anxiously at her son. Would you make up with Linda and move on with your life? You have a daughter growing up. How will she be without her father? I'll see my daughter, but I won't live with Linda anymore, Albert said. Let's not bring it up again. Come on, I'd better show you your room. He took his mother to the room where Angelina used to live. Now you'll live here and no one will bother you. What about you, son? Amelia got worried. Will you be uncomfortable in a passageway room? What if I have to go to the loo in the middle of the night? I'll go and wake you up. You won't? Albert laughed. I sleep so soundly that a tank will pass by and I won't hear it. Come on, Mum. Make yourself comfortable. And tomorrow you and I will go to the shop to buy you clothes and anything else you need. I'll cook something. You and I are going to eat. And you're going to tell me how you've lived all these years. Albert was just finishing frying potatoes when his phone rang. Linda appeared on the screen. He wrinkled his nose and didn't answer the call. The phone rang again and again. Albert even had to switch it off so it wouldn't interfere with his communication with his mum. After about an hour, someone rang the doorbell. Who the hell is that? Albert grumbled as he clicked the lock. Linda stood on the doorstep. Why don't you answer my calls and messages? She asked indignantly. Do you want me to resent you even more? She pushed Albert away and walked into the hallway. If you apologize to me now, then so be it. Linda looked condescendingly at her husband. I will forgive you, but for the last time. If it happens again, you will never see me again. I don't want to see you now, Albert replied calmly. Why did you come here? Linda noticed her mother-in-law, who came out of her room. What is that one doing in our flat? She pointed at Amelia. That's my mum, Albert frowned. And now she's going to live here with me. And you don't belong here anymore. Go away. He waved his hand towards the door. You have nothing to do with this flat. Then you'll never see our daughter again, Linda used the last argument. I'll terminate your paternity. We'll talk about it in court. Albert was unfazed. No one can stop me from having contact with my child, so calm down and leave. I'll file for divorce myself so you don't have to bother. Albert, Linda suddenly cried, why don't we try to start over? If you want, we can move in with my parents. Or rent a flat. Let your mum live here. I'm sorry, but I don't love you anymore, Albert shook his head. And you probably don't love me either. What's the point of having a family like this? Can I at least take the rest of my things? Her voice trembled with excitement. I don't mind. Take it, he allowed. Just hurry up. Mum's tired, and it's time for her to rest. Without saying hello to her mother-in-law, Linda quickly packed everything she needed into bags and went out the door. Son, maybe you shouldn't do that to Linda? Amelia asked cautiously. I don't know what's wrong, said Amelia. There's no such thing as a husband and wife. They had a fight. They make up. No, Mum, I can't do that, Albert shook his head. Remember how Grandma used to say there's heaven in a cage with a sweetheart, so I want to live in love and harmony. And who else but you, Mum, would love me so sincerely and completely unselfishly? You've always loved me more than anyone else in the world. And now I have to take care of you. I'm the happiest man in the world because I have you, Mom.